Somewhere beneath the sun-baked dirt of southern Iraq, there's a layer of clay so thin you could miss it if you weren't looking. But that layer marks something enormous. It marks the moment an entire civilization, the first civilization, started coming apart at the seams. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years, canals that had fed hundreds of thousands of people, a writing system that recorded the very first laws, the very first poems, the very first complaints about bad beer. All of it gone or unravelling within a few generations. And here's the unsettling part. The signs were there long before the collapse actually hit. People just didn't know how to read them. We like to think we're different. We've got satellites, supply chains stretching across oceans, instant communication, climate models running on supercomputers. Surely we'd see it coming if something like that started happening again. But that's exactly what the Sumerians probably thought too. They had irrigation systems more sophisticated than anything the ancient world had seen. They had trade networks connecting them to civilizations 1,000 miles away. They had bureaucracies, treaties, early forms of diplomacy. And it still wasn't enough. Tonight, we're going to walk through 7 signs, 7 warning signals buried in the archaeological and historical record, that mark how ancient Near Eastern civilizations slid toward collapse again and again across nearly 2,000 years. And by the end, you might start noticing some of those same signs today. If you're listening to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So relax, get comfortable, and let your mind drift while we go back to a world of clay tablets, dying rivers, and empires that thought they'd last forever. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing it. Tokyo at midnight, Chicago at dinner, London just waking up. And if these videos help you unwind, the best way to support the channel is by following on Spotify and leaving a 5-star review. There's a link in the description now. Let's go back nearly 4,200 years to the moment the rain simply stopped. Number 1 on our list, the 4.2 Kiloyear Megadrought, and the sudden fragmentation of the Akkadian Empire. If you've never heard of the 4.2 Kiloyear event, you're not alone. It doesn't get the same attention as the fall of Rome or the collapse of the Bronze Age. But in terms of sheer scale, it might be one of the most significant climate events in human history. And it left its fingerprints on ice cores, cave formations, lake sediments, and ocean floors on nearly every continent on Earth. Around 2200 BCE, something happened to the global climate system. Nobody's entirely sure what triggered it. Some researchers point to shifts in ocean circulation patterns. Others suggest volcanic activity that pumped enough aerosols into the atmosphere to alter rainfall patterns worldwide. Whatever the cause, the result was unmistakable: a sudden, severe, and prolonged period of aridification that hit large parts of the globe simultaneously. This wasn't a regional dry spell. This was a planetary event. Geologists actually use this moment as a marker for an entire unit of geological time. The Megalayan Age, the most recent stage of the Holocene epoch, officially begins right here, at 2200 BCE, named after a cave in Meghalaya, India, where stalagmites recorded a dramatic shift in oxygen isotopes. That shift indicates a sudden change in monsoon patterns. Weaker rains, drier conditions stretching on for centuries. And Meghalaya is just one data point in a much larger global picture. In Africa, lake sediment cores from places like Lake Victoria show the same signature. Water levels dropping, vegetation patterns shifting toward more drought-tolerant species. In China, evidence suggests the Yangtze River region experienced disruptions serious enough to be linked with the decline of Neolithic cultures there. In the Andes, ice cores from high-altitude glaciers show a similar climatic disturbance around the same centuries. This wasn't just a Mesopotamian problem. This was something the entire world seemed to feel at once, even though most of these ancient societies had no way of knowing what was happening thousands of miles away. But nowhere does the story hit harder than in the Near East. Because in the Near East, this drought didn't just affect scattered farming villages or hunter-gatherer bands. It struck at the very heart of the world's first empire. By 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad, roughly a century earlier, had unified much of Mesopotamia under a single political structure for the first time in recorded history. This wasn't a loose network of city-states occasionally cooperating. This was something new, a centralized empire with administrative control stretching from the Persian Gulf up through northern Mesopotamia, encompassing Sumerian cities in the south and Akkadian-speaking populations further north. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, expanded it even further, and inscriptions from his reign practically drip with confidence. He called himself King of the Four Quarters of the World, a title suggesting total, unchallenged dominance. And then, within a generation or two of that boast, the empire began falling apart. The archaeological evidence for what happened next comes from multiple sites across the region, but perhaps the clearest signal comes from marine sediment cores pulled from the Gulf of Oman. Researchers studying these cores found a distinct layer of wind-blown dust that originated from Mesopotamia itself, deposited into the sea during a period of intense aridity dated to right around 2200 BCE. This dust layer tells us something important. The soils of Mesopotamia were drying out and blowing away. Fields that had once supported dense agricultural populations were turning to dust and being carried off by the wind out over the water, settling into the sediment where scientists would find it 4,000 years later. Think about what that actually means on the ground. Rivers that had reliably flooded their banks every year, depositing fresh silt and moisture for crops, started flowing lower and less predictably. Rainfall, which had never been abundant in this region to begin with, became even scarcer. The delicate balance that allowed Mesopotamian agriculture to feed dense urban populations, a balance built on canals, careful water management, and generations of accumulated knowledge, started to break down. And here's the part that should give you a chill if you think about it too long. This wasn't a slow, centuries-long drift toward drier conditions that people had generations to adapt to. The evidence increasingly points toward something faster, more sudden, a shift occurring across a matter of decades, maybe even faster. Fast enough that agricultural systems built around one set of climate assumptions suddenly found themselves operating in a completely different reality with little time to adjust. Historical texts from the period, though sometimes difficult to interpret and separate from later mythologizing, seem to echo this environmental disaster. There are references to failed harvests, to grain shortages, to disruptions in the systems that had once reliably moved food from productive regions to hungry cities. One famous text, sometimes called the Curse of Akkad, written sometime after the empire's fall, describes drought and famine in almost apocalyptic terms, though scholars debate how literally to take its descriptions versus how much is later religious or political commentary layered on top of real memory. What we can say with more confidence is this: the timing lines up. The empire that Sargon built, the empire Naram-Sin boasted about ruling to the edges of the world, began fragmenting into smaller competing powers right around the same centuries that marine sediments, cave deposits, and lake cores across the globe were recording a dramatic, synchronized shift toward drier, harsher conditions. Correlation isn't the same as proof. Historians and climate scientists are still working out exactly how directly connected these two stories are. But the overlap is striking enough that it's hard to ignore. And when we look closer at the archaeological sites scattered across northern Mesopotamia, sites that were right on the front line of this environmental shift, the picture gets even more vivid. When archaeologists started digging into those northern sites, they didn't just find some drought evidence. They found entire landscapes caught in the act of shutting down. Take Tel Leilan in what is now northeastern Syria. During the height of the Akkadian period, this place was booming. It sat in the so-called Upper Mesopotamian dry farming belt, a region that normally depended on winter rains rather than big irrigation systems. Under Akkadian rule, those marginal lands were turned into a kind of imperial breadbasket. Fields were ploughed, villages expanded, storage facilities were built to capture the surplus and send it south. Then something snapped. In the layers dated to around 2200 BCE, the pattern at Leilan changes abruptly. The flourishing urban occupation level is followed by what archaeologists call an abandonment horizon. In plain language, people packed up and left, not over a slow, graceful decline, but in a relatively sharp break. Above the last Akkadian-era floors, instead of more houses and workshops, you start seeing wind-blown dust and sand. The site literally gets buried by the desert, and it's not just the absence of people that tells the story. It's the tiny fragments of plants and animals they left behind. Pollen grains trapped in the sediments shift from species associated with wetter conditions and agriculture to those that thrive in dry, steppe-like environments. Charred remains of crops suggest stressed harvests. In some nearby sites you even see the appearance of more drought-tolerant cereals, like barley displacing wheat, as farmers desperately try to adapt to less reliable rainfall. Even more unsettling is the discovery of what some researchers call crisis architecture. In the latest Akkadian levels at Leilan and similar sites, buildings get subdivided, repurposed, squeezed into available corners. Large public or administrative spaces are partitioned into smaller rooms, as if authorities are trying to cram more people into protected areas, or convert any remaining infrastructure into storage and emergency housing. It looks like a society improvising in real time as the climate shifts under its feet. Farther west, at sites like Tel Brak, another former regional powerhouse, you see a similar pattern. Monumental buildings lose their maintenance. Trash starts accumulating in once prestigious areas. Domestic activities move into spaces that used to be reserved for elites. There are signs of short-term reuse, squatter occupation, and then silence. Occupation thins out, then disappears from the archaeological record for generations. One of the most telling signatures isn't just what shows up at a single site, but how many sites vanish from the map at the same time. Survey data across northern Mesopotamia show a dense scatter of small villages and towns during the Akkadian period. After the 42K event kicks in, the number of occupied sites plummets. The countryside empties. When settlements do reappear centuries later, they're often smaller, more dispersed, and organized under completely different political systems. Burial evidence, fragmentary as it is, seems to echo a period of stress. In some regions, formal cemeteries go out of use or shrink dramatically. In others, graves get simpler, poorer, less elaborate. It's as if whatever surplus once funded rich funerary rituals evaporated. You don't build lavish tombs when you're struggling to feed the living. There are also hints of movement and displacement. Pottery styles, for example, suddenly shift in some northern areas to types associated with highland or steppe groups. That suggests that as the rain-fed farmlands failed, populations may have turned more mobile, mixing with or becoming pastoralists, following herds instead of relying on increasingly unreliable fields. The empire's northern agrarian backbone starts looking more like a patchwork of camps and shrinking villages than a stable network of grain-producing towns. What you do not see in these northern layers is a smooth handoff from Akkadian rule to some new, equally centralized power. You see gaps, you see interruptions. The urban fabric that had been tightly woven under Sargon and Naram-Sin tiers, and for a while no one manages to stitch it back together at the same scale. And yet, even in the middle of this contraction, there are clues that people were trying every possible strategy to hang on. Short-lived attempts to deepen wells, hints of small canal extensions nibbling farther out into marginal lands, storage jars tucked into odd corners, as if every bit of surplus was being hoarded against the next failed harvest. These aren't the traces of a lazy, decadent elite letting everything rot. They're the fingerprints of a population pushed into survival mode. When you zoom out and line up all these northern sites, a pattern emerges that's hard to ignore. Settlements expand under favourable conditions, are integrated into an imperial system that depends on their grain, then face a sudden climate shock that makes their location and economic role far more precarious than anyone had planned for. The empire's frontier turns out to be sitting right where the climate line is about to move, and that's where the Sumerian reset cycle starts to look uncomfortably familiar. Because what happened next wasn't just empty fields and abandoned towns. It was what filled the power vacuum those empty fields created, especially back in the wealthy southern cities that depended on northern grain to keep their own urban experiment alive. When the north started failing, the south didn't collapse overnight. At first it did what big systems always do when the periphery goes wobbly. It doubled down on control. The royal inscriptions from this period don't say, "We're running out of grain and the climate is destabilizing." They say, "Rebellion has broken out." The gods are angry. The king marched north and crushed the enemies. You can almost hear the spin. There are texts describing substitution rituals where a fake king is put on the throne temporarily to absorb bad omens. There are references to cities being punished, statues of gods being dragged away, walls being torn down. One famous inscription of Naram-Sin tells of a coalition of rebellious cities that had to be brutally suppressed, and of the king personally leading campaigns to restore order. If you just read the texts, it sounds like political drama. But now set that against the archaeological picture you've just seen in the north. Fields failing, settlements emptying, food surpluses evaporating. Suddenly the rebels and bandits look a lot like hungry subjects, and displaced populations trying not to starve. This is the first way climate stress amplifies political fault lines. It turns ordinary grievances into existential ones. Under normal conditions, an empire can paper over injustice with bread and jobs. You can tax people hard and conscript their sons as long as there's enough grain left to keep them alive. But when the climate flips and your northern breadbasket becomes a dust bowl, every existing inequality gets sharper. If you were a small farmer already squeezed by imperial demands, a couple of failed harvests wouldn't just be bad years, they'd be a death sentence. If you were a local governor resented by your subjects, famine would turn that resentment into open hatred. If you were a nomadic group just outside the imperial heartland, watching caravans of food still flowing toward the king's storehouses, you might decide it was time to raid instead of trade. The weather doesn't invent those tensions, it just presses on them all at once. In Mesopotamia, one of the biggest lines of tension ran between city and countryside, core and frontier. Southern cities like Akkad and had grown used to a steady river of grain coming down from the rain-fed north. That flow underwrote everything. The scribes, the temples, the standing armies, the palace construction projects, the luxury goods. When that river of grain slowed, the cities faced an impossible choice. Either tighten belts at the top, or squeeze even harder at the edges. Empires almost never choose to shrink their own consumption first. There are hints in the records that military campaigns intensified just as the climate stress peaked. That might look like the king losing his mind and waging unnecessary wars. But viewed through the lens of drought, those campaigns start to look like a desperate attempt to reimpose tribute, to keep the grain moving by force when cooperation was no longer voluntary. And here is the cruel paradox. The very tools that made the Akkadian state powerful in good times made it brittle in bad ones. Centralized bureaucracy is fantastic when the environment is stable. You can coordinate labor, build canals, smooth out local shortages with long-distance redistribution. But that same centralization means that when your information is wrong, it's wrong everywhere. If the palace is still working off old assumptions about how much grain the north can produce, it will keep demanding quotas that are literally impossible to deliver. Local officials then have to improvise. They underreport, or they brutalize their districts trying to hit targets that no longer make sense. Trust breaks down vertically between centre and periphery, and horizontally between neighbouring communities suddenly competing for shrinking resources. That's another way climate stress amplifies the cracks. It makes coordination problems lethal. A village alone can adapt, switch crops, thin the herd, move to better water. But an imperial system that has tightly locked regions together, standardized labor obligations and fixed tribute routes can't flex that easily. Its whole stability depends on yesterday looking enough like tomorrow. At the 4.2 Kiloyear mark, tomorrow stopped looking like yesterday. We also see old identity lines reignite: highland versus lowland, pastoralists versus farmers, city gods versus country gods. Later traditions remember Gutians, mountain people from the Zagros, surging into Mesopotamia after the fall of Akkad. The texts vilify them as destructive barbarians who knew not proper cultic practice. But if you step back, it looks like a familiar pattern. When settled agrarian systems falter, more mobile groups, less tied to failing fields, gain an edge. Drought doesn't create the Gutians. It just tilts the playing field so their survival strategies suddenly work better than those of the people in brick houses and irrigated fields. To the cities, that feels like invasion. To the Highlanders, it probably felt like opportunity, or simply necessity. Zoom even further out, and a broader reset comes into view. The Akkadian imperial experiment had stretched the Sumerian landscape to its limits. More people crowded into cities, more marginal lands brought under cultivation, more dependence on long-distance food chains. That complexity worked as long as the environment cooperated. Once the climate turned, that same complexity became a liability. The system didn't just quietly downsize, it fractured. Southern cities lost their northern safety net. Northern farmers abandoned fields that had become traps. Regional powers re-emerged, Isin, Larsa, each inheriting fragments of the old order, but none able to reassemble it at the same scale, at least not right away. From a distance of 4,000 years, it looks like a cycle: growth, overreach, external shock, fragmentation, reorganization. The Sumerian reset. And here's where this isn't just a story about some long-dead empire baking under an ancient sun. Because the 4.2 Kiloyear drought didn't cause the collapse of Akkad all by itself. It exposed how tightly bound, how unbalanced, how politically fragile that civilization had become. It turned manageable stresses into cascading failures. We live in a world that is also highly centralized, deeply interconnected, and built on assumptions about climate stability that may no longer hold. When our own environmental baselines shift, whatever fault lines already exist in inequality, in resource distribution, in trust between centre and periphery, won't politely stay the same. They'll widen. The question isn't whether the climate will change. It already is. The question is how much tension is already built into our systems, waiting for that shove. Because for the Sumerians and Akkadians, the drought was that shove. For us, it might be the opening signal that the next phase of the reset cycle has already begun. 2. Southern Mesopotamia's irrigation salinization. When the northern rains failed, the south still had its trump card, the rivers. From the perspective of an ancient Mesopotamian, the Tigris and Euphrates must have looked like a cheat code. While the sky grew unreliable, the rivers kept sliding past the city walls, day after day, season after season. All you had to do was open more canals, mobilize more labour, pull more water onto the land. So that's what they did. Southern Mesopotamia is basically a giant river-made pancake, flat, low and dry enough that if you don't irrigate, not much grows. The Sumerians had mastered this reality long before the Akkadian kings showed up. They cut canals out of the riverbanks, dug branch channels off the main canals, then smaller ditches off those. A web of water turning desert into farmland. On a good year, it must have felt like a miracle. You could look out from the city ramparts and see a green patchwork stretching to the horizon. Barley and wheat waving in the wind, date palms along the canal banks, herds grazing on the stubble. And all of it apparently under human control. The gods sent the river, but people decided where it flowed. There was just one problem. The same water that gave life was quietly poisoning the ground. To see why, you have to zoom in beneath the crops, down into the soil itself. River water isn't pure. It carries dissolved minerals and salts picked up upstream from rocks and soils. In a natural floodplain, that water spills out only once a year, spreads thin, soaks in, then drains or evaporates. Over centuries, the river wanders, the floods shift, the salts get diluted and flushed away. But an irrigation canal is not a natural flood. It's a machine. Imagine a field a little lower than the canal next to it. Farmers open a gate, water pours in, spreads across the surface, then soaks down. The plants take what they need. The rest has two options: drain out through the soil and back toward the river, or go up. In southern Mesopotamia, down was not always available. The water table was already high, just a few meters below the surface. The land is almost completely flat, with nowhere for excess water to flow. When you add irrigation on top of that, you're effectively saturating a sponge that's already almost full. So the extra water goes up. Under the hot Mesopotamian sun, that water moves toward the surface and evaporates. But when it leaves as vapour, it abandons its salt. Sodium, chloride, gypsum, all the invisible passengers carried in with the river water are left behind, grain by grain, year after year. The result is simple physics but devastating agriculture. Every irrigation cycle pulls in a small package of salts. Every evaporation cycle unpacks it and leaves it in the root zone, exactly where the crops live. At first, nobody notices. The soil looks the same. Maybe some patches yield a little less, but there are always reasons: bad seed, lazy workers, the wrong ploughing date. You compensate by watering more, by extending a canal, by opening new land. That solution is exactly what makes the problem worse. The more frequently you irrigate, the more salt you import. The more you keep fields continuously wet, the more the water table rises, bringing old buried salts up to the surface. Over decades, shallow groundwater becomes brackish, then salty. In some places it probably started to taste like seawater. Farmers would have seen the symptoms long before they understood the mechanism. The first sign is stress. Crops that used to grow tall and lush now come in shorter, yellowed at the tips. Some patches turn patchy and stunted. Weeds that tolerate salt start to flourish where wheat once stood. Then comes the crust. If you walked those fields at the wrong time of year after harvest, you might have heard it, a faint crunch underfoot. a thin white or grey film along the surface of the furrows, like frost that never melts. That salt literally crystallized out of the soil water as it evaporated. In modern salinized fields across the same region, you can see this clearly, a white sheen, bare spots where nothing will grow. It's not hard to imagine Sumerian farmers 3,000 or 4,000 years ago staring at the same ghostly film and wondering what curse had settled on their land. The curse wasn't supernatural, it was feedback. Irrigation worked incredibly well in the short term, so they scaled it up. Bigger canals, longer canal chains reaching further from the rivers. More marginal land brought under the plough to feed growing cities and armies. Each expansion seemed rational, even necessary, especially once the northern grain shipments faltered. But every acre added to the irrigation grid was one more acre plugged into the slow salting machine. There were ways out, at least in theory. You can leach salts downward by flooding fields and letting the excess water drain away. You can build deep drains to lower the water table. You can rotate fields out of cultivation, letting winter rains flush them. All of that requires two things ancient states rarely have in abundance: spare land and political patience. Southern Mesopotamia was running out of both. As canals multiplied and harvests became essential to keeping cities alive, letting prime fields rest for years would have felt like madness. So they kept them in rotation, season after season, squeezing every possible grain out of soil that was slowly turning hostile. And as the hostility grew, the land itself began to dictate what could and couldn't be grown there next. At first, the land only whispered its preferences. Then it started shouting. In the earliest Sumerian records we can read, "Wheat is everywhere." Emmer and einkorn listed line after line in cuneiform tablets from early city-states like Uruk and Lagash. Rations in wheat, temple offerings in wheat, fields described as wheat fields by default, as if that's just what real grain was. Wheat was the prestige crop. It bakes into softer bread, stores well, and in the early days the soils and water quality could still support it. If you were the temple administrator in charge of feeding priests and officials, you wanted wheat in your ledgers. Barley was there too, but it was second tier. Practical, hardy, a little rougher. The grain of beer, porridge, and poorer households. Then, century by century, the tablets start to change. This is where the story gets eerie, because we're not guessing from pollen or dirt layers. We're reading the paperwork of a civilization slowly backed into a corner. Cuneiform was a bureaucrat's dream. Every sack of grain, every field assignment, every worker's ration could be pressed into clay. And those clay tablets, once they're baked or just dried in the right conditions, outlive almost everything. Archaeologists have gone through thousands of them. What they see is not a random fluctuation, but a directional shift. In the early dynastic period, around the 3rd millennium BCE, wheat still holds a strong position in the accounts. But by the time you get into the later 3rd millennium, especially in the southern cities, barley is taking over the columns. At first it's subtle, a higher proportion of barley in the mix. More fields designated for barley instead of wheat. Then it becomes unmistakable. Entire estates that once listed both crops now record barley exclusively. Tax records that used to be flexible wheat or barley depending on local conditions start standardizing in one direction. It's as if the scribes are saying, without ever spelling it out, wheat doesn't work here anymore. You can see it in the big institutional accounts. Temples and palaces record what's coming in from their dependent villages. Early on it's a blend. So many gur of wheat, so many of barley. Later, those same villages send almost nothing but barley. The wheat lines shrink, then vanish. This isn't just fashion. Wheat and barley respond differently to salt. Wheat is sensitive. Yields drop sharply once salt levels in the root zone creep above a fairly narrow threshold. Barley can hang on in much harsher conditions. You still lose yield as salinity rises, but it dies slower. If your fields are quietly accumulating salts, wheat is the first to complain. Barley just grits its teeth and keeps growing. The tablets track that transition in real time. In some regions, you see a spatial pattern. Upstream, closer to fresher water and somewhat better drainage, wheat lingers longer in the accounts. Downstream, where the river has already offloaded more of its mineral burden, and the water table sits closer to the surface, barley dominates earlier. That upstream-downstream gradient is exactly what modern soil scientists would predict in a long-term irrigation system. The fact that the scribes never talk about salinity doesn't matter. Their numbers are telling the story for them. There are even hints of desperation in how grain is categorized and valued. In some city archives, the conversion rates between barley and other goods shift over time. Barley rations become the norm for labourers. Wheat, when it appears, is more closely associated with elite consumption and special distributions. Not because wheat suddenly became tastier, but because it became rarer. Imagine being a farmer in that world. Your grandfather's field grew wheat without issue. Your father saw mixed harvests, some patches failing, others still good enough. By your time, wheat barely pushes through in the same soil. You hear about villages upriver that still manage it, but on your plot it's a gamble. So you switch to barley. Not because you want to, but because you can't afford a failed season. On the other side of that decision is a scribe, stylus in hand, adjusting the accounting categories. Where his predecessors wrote wheat and barley, he now writes barley. Where they left options open in contracts, renters owing a certain amount of grain, he starts specifying which grain that actually means. Over hundreds of tablets, across multiple city-states, the same pattern repeats. In some periods, you even see attempts to push back. Short-term spikes of wheat planting show up in the records, like experiments or hopes that maybe this year will be different. Maybe a run of good river years. Maybe some local reclamation effort. Maybe a new canal alignment promised fresher water. For a decade or two, the wheat lines bump up. Then they sag again. Barley surges back, and this time it doesn't retreat. To historians of Mesopotamia, this crop shift is one of the most tangible fingerprints of environmental stress. They don't have to rely on poetic laments or mythic curses. The cold, dry accounting tablets, the kind that list how many donkeys ate, how many measures of grain in which month, are quietly documenting a structural change in what the land will support. From a distance, it can look like a simple substitution. Wheat out, barley in. A technical fix. The system adapts, keeps going, problem solved. But underneath those neat cuneiform columns is a darker reality. You only move your entire agricultural base from a preferred, high-status staple to a tougher, lower-status one when you're being forced by something you can't easily negotiate with. And across southern Mesopotamia, that something was sitting beneath everyone's feet. Salt. Not the kind you sprinkle on food, the kind that sits in your soil, invisible, ruthless, and almost impossible to evict once it's moved in. Barley's takeover buys you time, but it doesn't reset the system. It just stretches out the runway, because here's the uncomfortable truth about long-term salinization. It rarely hits as a single cinematic catastrophe. It creeps year by year, yield by yield, until one day you realize the math no longer works. Modern agronomists can chart this in experiments. Take a salt-sensitive crop, slowly raise the salinity of the irrigation water, and you'll see something very familiar. First, a gentle decline in yields, then a steeper drop, then a cliff. Switch that crop for a more tolerant one, and you delay the cliff, but you don't flatten the slope. You're still losing capacity, just more slowly. The Sumerians were living that graph without the benefit of writing it down. Barley's tolerance meant that fields that would have completely failed under wheat could still give something, but something is a dangerous word in a food system. A city isn't fed by something, it's fed by surpluses, predictable enough to support non-farmers. Scribes, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, rulers, and the armies of workers who don't touch a plough. When your baseline yields begin to slide, a civilization with fixed expectations has three options: expand, intensify, or squeeze. Expansion is the most obvious. If each acre produces less, you bring more acres under cultivation. Southern Mesopotamian rulers did exactly that. Canal systems grew more sprawling, marginal lands that had been left fallow or used as pasture were pulled into the grain machine. New branches off older canals pushed further into the floodplain. On paper, this looks like success. More irrigated land, more canals, more development, but you're spreading the same environmental pressure over a wider area. The underlying process that forced you to plant barley is now touching more fields, more villages, more households. Intensification is the next move. You work the land harder. You shorten fallow periods. You squeeze in more cropping cycles. You tweak irrigation schedules to try to get just a bit more grain out of stressed soil. In the short term, this can cover the gap. In the long term, it accelerates the very salinization you're trying to outrun. Then there's squeezing. If the landscape can no longer deliver the surplus it once did, someone still has to absorb the shortfall. Temples and palaces can't easily cut their consumption. Armies and elites are politically fragile to touch. So the pressure travels down the hierarchy. Rations for labourers get trimmed. Debts mount as farmers borrow seed grain after bad harvests. Tax obligations measured in grain become harder and harder to meet in bad years, then in average years, then in what used to be good years. Sumerian legal and economic texts are full of debt slavery, pledging of family members, and the periodic clean slate decrees where kings cancel obligations and free bondservants. Those edicts are often framed as moral or religious acts, restoring cosmic order. But behind the rhetoric lurks arithmetic, a system where marginal producers are being ground down by a combination of ecological decline and rigid demands. Fragility isn't just about how much food a region produces, it's about how close its production sits to the threshold of social breakdown. As salinity rose and barley held the line, barely buffers shrank. The room for error between tight year and famine narrowed. A dry sequence of flood years, a pest outbreak, a localized conflict that interrupted canal maintenance, anything that might have been survivable in a plump, wheat-fed era now had sharper edges. Think about it in terms of resilience layers. At first, the land itself is your buffer. Fertile soils and flexible water flows can absorb mistakes, a poorly maintained canal here, an overambitious planting there. The system forgives you as the land degrades. You lean on social and technological buffers instead. More canals, more bureaucracy to track grain, more complex tax systems to funnel resources from still productive areas to struggling ones, more forced labour to keep irrigation works functioning. For a while it works. The solution to salinized fields downstream is grain from less damaged upstream districts. The solution to declining free peasant yields is to pull more dependent labour into temple and palace estates. The solution to uneven harvests is to tighten control. But every solution adds complexity and cost. You need more administration to manage grain flows, more coercion to extract from reluctant farmers, more ideological work, myths, rituals, royal propaganda, to stabilize a population that's increasingly aware that their lives are getting harder. This is where the story stops being about soil chemistry and starts rhyming with modern systems. A food base that's quietly shrinking in productivity forces societies to ride closer and closer to the edge. They look stable, cities still stand, temples still function, accounts still get written, but their margin for shock is evaporating. When historians talk about later Mesopotamian crises, political fragmentation, city abandonment, power shifting northward away from the most heavily irrigated, most salinized regions, that's the visible tip. Beneath it is a century scale wearing down of the land's generosity. And that's the deeper warning. Civilizations don't always fall because of one spectacular disaster. Sometimes they pre-collapse slowly by trading long-term ecological health for short-term stability, year after year, until tiny stresses become existential threats. In southern Mesopotamia, the move from wheat to barley was a brilliant adaptation. It kept millions of people fed for centuries longer than a more brittle system would have managed. But it also masked the underlying trend, a slow, steady downgrade of the carrying capacity that everything else depended on. By the time the system realized how much resilience it had spent, it was already locked into canals it couldn't abandon, institutions it couldn't easily reform, and expectations it couldn't painlessly lower. And this is where Sumer's story starts to bleed into ours. Because we are doing something very similar right now, on a planetary scale. Only our salinity problem doesn't come just from rivers and canals. 3. The Amarna letters Late Bronze Age system crash. If Sumer's salinized fields show you how a civilization can slowly burn through its ecological credit, the next case shows you what happens when a whole network of civilizations starts running out of slack at the same time. Fast forward more than 1,000 years from the Akkadians, past old Babylonian kings and Middle Kingdom pharaohs into the Late Bronze Age, around 1350 BCE. The world you're about to walk into is nothing like the scrappy city-states of early Mesopotamia. This is a world of superpowers. Egypt under the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia, Kassite Babylonia in the south, Assyria rising in the middle. Canaanite city-states dotting the Levantine coast. On a map it looks like a dense mesh of kingdoms and vassals. In reality, it behaved more like a single operating system stretched over half the eastern Mediterranean. And we know this not because of some later historian, but because the participants themselves left behind their inbox. That inbox is called the Amarna Archive. In the 1880s, villagers digging in Middle Egypt near a place we now call Amarna stumbled on hundreds of sun-baked clay tablets. Not Egyptian hieroglyphs, but wedge-shaped cuneiform, the writing system of Mesopotamia. Pharaoh's mailroom written in a foreign script. These tablets turned out to be diplomatic correspondence, letters between the Egyptian court and the other great powers, plus a swarm of smaller princes and city rulers, all trying to get the pharaoh's attention. Think of it as the hacked email server of the late Bronze Age elite. And what it shows is that by the mid-14th century BCE, the real infrastructure holding this world together wasn't just roads, ships, and caravans. It was an elite network, a tightly woven web of kings, queens, princes, ambassadors, and royal households, all constantly talking, bargaining, marrying, and swapping favours. To be taken seriously in this system, you didn't just need an army and walls. You needed a slot in that network. One of the first things the Amarna letters reveal is how these rulers thought of themselves. The pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Hatti, the king of Babylonia, the king of Mitanni, when they wrote to each other they used the language of family. Thus says the king of Egypt to the king of Babylon, my brother, why have you, my brother, not sent the proper gifts? May the gods keep you, my brother, and your household in good health. Brother here doesn't mean affection. It's a rank. It signals that you recognize each other as peers in a club of great kings. Everyone else Canaanite city-state rulers, minor Levantine princes, Cypriot governors, get downgraded to servants or sons. This is the late Bronze Age version of a verified account badge. Who gets to say brother to whom tells you exactly where they sit in the geopolitical hierarchy. The second thing you notice is how material this brotherhood is. These letters are obsessed with gifts: gold, lapis lazuli, fine textiles, chariots, horses, exotic woods, luxury goods. A huge portion of the correspondence is basically meticulous complaining about who sent what, when, and in what quality. One king writes that the gold jewellery sent by another looked like copper. Another fumes that he sent his daughter in marriage with an enormous dowry, but the return gifts were embarrassingly small. Another warns that if he doesn't get the timber and craftsmen he asked for, he can't complete a palace as promised. On the surface this sounds petty. Underneath it's accounting. These aren't random presents, they're system maintenance. Every shipment of gold, every consignment of horses, every princess sent abroad to marry a foreign king is a way of locking in alliances, stabilizing borders, and smoothing over potential conflict. You keep the peace not just with treaties, but with a constant flow of highly visible, highly symbolic goods. A great king who stops sending appropriate gifts isn't just being rude. He's signalling that his capacity or his willingness to uphold his end of the shared order is weakening. And here's where the Amarna archive becomes really revealing. Elite networks like this don't just move luxuries. They move risk. When a famine hits one region, you lean on brothers to send grain. When rebels threaten a vassal city, you expect your overlord to dispatch troops. When a neighbour's succession looks shaky, you send a princess to marry the new king and anchor him in your orbit. The letters show this logic in action. A Canaanite city ruler will write to Egypt, "I am your servant, your dust under your feet. The enemy is at my gates. Send troops, send archers, or the king will lose his city." A great king of Babylon will remind Egypt that in the past, when Egypt was in need, Babylon sent grain. Now it's time for the favour to be returned with gold. Every request, every promise, every complaint is built on the assumption that the network will function, that messages will get through, caravans will arrive, tribute will be collected, reinforcements will march, brides will be delivered. And for a while, it works. The Amarna world is hyper-interconnected. Royal sons are raised at foreign courts as hostages and future allies. Canaanite princes hold Egyptian titles. Local disputes in one coastal town can trigger exchanges between 3 or 4 distant palaces. If Sumer's resilience was rooted in canals and grain silos, late Bronze Age resilience was increasingly rooted in this invisible wiring between palaces. But there's a hidden cost. When you stitch elites together this tightly, you create a kind of diplomatic metapopulation. Individual cities can fall, kings can die, dynasties can wobble, but as long as the network as a whole can root around the damage, the system survives. The problem is that the more you rely on that network to move grain, troops, brides, and prestige goods, the more brittle your world becomes when those connections start to fray. And in the Amarna archive, if you read past the polite formulas and the gold complaints, you can already hear the static building on the line. Underneath the flowery greetings and formal insults, the tone of the letters starts to change. At first you mostly see the usual gripes about late gifts and subpar gold. But as you move deeper into the archive, another theme keeps breaking through the diplomatic small talk: shortage. Not the normal cyclical kind of scarcity ancient farmers expected. Something more chronic, more systemic. You start seeing kings who should be talking about prestige and marriage alliances instead begging for calories. One vassal ruler in Canaan writes to the pharaoh, "There is no grain in my city." We are all dead men if the king does not send grain quickly. Another complains that the harvest has failed and the storehouses are empty, and that unless grain ships arrive from Egypt, his people will abandon the city. What's striking is how matter-of-fact this sounds. They don't treat hunger as a local misfortune. They treat outside grain as a normal part of how the system is supposed to work. Egypt is the breadbasket. The Nile floods. Egypt produces surplus, and that surplus moves out along political lines, to loyal vassals, allied courts, strategic ports, until it doesn't. Because alongside the pleas for food, you start to see another pattern, repeated references to delays, neglect, and forgetfulness. A ruler will write, "Why has the king not sent the grain as in the days of my father?" Another, more desperate, says that he has already written 3 times and received no reply. Someone at the Egyptian court is sitting on messages, or doesn't have the capacity to respond like before, or both. In a stable system, a crop failure in one region is patched by an influx from somewhere else. In the Amarna letters you can see that patching mechanism starting to misfire. And as soon as material support becomes unreliable, the predators move in. The tablets are full of complaints about bandits, brigands, apiru, habiru, enemy men, depending on the scribe and the language. For a long time, historians tried to match these groups to specific ethnicities. Today, many think they were more like status categories: semi-nomadic groups, displaced peasants, mercenaries, people on the margins of formal power. What matters for our story is that everyone is suddenly terrified of them. Canaanite city rulers complain that their hinterlands are being raided, their caravans attacked, their villages burned. They warn that if Egyptian archers don't arrive, all the king's land will be lost. One governor says that he is holed up in his city, surrounded by enemies, unable to harvest the fields. Another claims that neighbouring rulers are secretly backing the raiders, using them as deniable proxies to grab territory and tribute. In other words, once the flow of food and favour from the centre becomes uncertain, local actors start breaking the rules of the game. In a healthy network, small kings don't openly raid each other's lands because they're all plugged into the same hierarchy. Egypt or Hatti or some other great power will eventually smack them down. But in the Amarna archive you start to see letters accusing rival vassals of switching sides, paying off raiders, or flirting with enemy empires. The diplomatic language is still there: your servant, your city, your land, but the reality on the ground is beginning to look more like a slowly unfolding civil war. From the perspective of these small rulers, this makes sense. Raiding and opportunism are rational strategies when the big players are distracted, delayed, or unable to enforce their previous promises. And the big players do seem distracted. Some letters from the great kings hint at their own problems. One foreign king apologizes for not sending the usual number of luxury goods because my country has suffered great losses. Another explains that there has been war near his borders and he must keep his troops at home. Even Egypt, sitting on the Nile's predictable flood, is clearly not meeting expectations. Vassals complain that the pharaoh has reduced the number of troops stationed in their cities. Others mention that Egyptian envoys have not visited for a long time, or that long-standing requests for garrisons have gone unanswered. You can read this as simple laziness, but in a world where maintaining foreign garrisons and shipping grain are expensive, it's more likely a sign of resource strain and political overextension. If Egypt's own labour, metal, or surplus grain is under pressure, whether from internal projects, court struggles, or environmental shifts, its ability to project power outward shrinks. The buffer zones that once soaked up shocks start to thin. Now combine that with the raiders. When grain shipments are late, caravans are more tempting targets. When garrisons are undermanned, borderlands become test zones. When small kings can't get troops from their overlord, they start hiring mercenaries, arming locals, calling in favours from rival empires. The Amarna letters capture this spiral in slow motion. Requests for grain shade into requests for soldiers. Pleas for soldiers blur into recriminations. I wrote to you and you did not send archers, and now my city is lost. A neighbour writes to claim that he, unlike others, has remained loyal, implying that loyalty is becoming optional. You can almost hear the shift in tone. Early letters assume that help will arrive. Later ones try to guilt, flatter, or threaten the pharaoh into action. Rulers remind Egypt of past favours. Did I not send my daughter to you? Have I not guarded the king's lands? They frame aid not as charity but as a debt owed. This is what a system crash looks like from inside the inbox. Everyone is still using the old vocabulary of obligation and order. But the physical realities underneath, grain in the storehouse, troops in the fortress, safe roads between cities, are eroding. And as that erosion deepens, the delays start to matter more than the promises, and the raids start to matter more than the titles on the tablets. Because once shortages and insecurity become normal, the behaviour of everyone plugged into the network begins to change, and that's where the real unravelling begins. Once that shift in behaviour starts, the whole network begins to rewire itself. At first it's improvised. A city that used to depend on Egyptian grain quietly starts buying from a neighbour tied to the Hittites. A vassal who once prided himself on loyalty begins sending gifts both to Egypt and to a rival power, hedging his bets. A merchant who used to travel on royal business now runs semi-private caravans, paying protection money to whatever bandit leader controls the next stretch of road. What you're seeing is the early stage of a trade dependency coming apart. For a couple of centuries before the Amarna age, the Eastern Mediterranean had been running on a very specific model, tightly linked, high-value, low-volume trade that depended on trust at the top. Gold for lapis, tin for copper, luxury textiles for war horses, prestige goods for political loyalty. Most long-distance exchange was controlled by palaces and temples. Contracts were enforced not by neutral courts but by the threat that some king somewhere could make your life miserable if you cheated his brother. Invisible behind every shipment was the implied force of chariots, archers, and diplomatic embarrassment. That only works as long as three things stay true. The big powers remain strong enough to punish defectors. Communication is fast and reliable enough to coordinate, and the physical flow of goods is predictable enough that everyone keeps trusting future deliveries. The Amarna letters show all three conditions starting to wobble at once. You read of messengers delayed for months or never arriving, of kings complaining that promised shipments have not come up to the measure, or that the gold sent from Egypt turned out to be alloyed, not pure, of vassals accusing each other of intercepting caravans or detaining envoys. Each incident on its own is manageable. Together, they chip away at the belief that the network still works. And once that belief cracks, everyone's incentives flip. Think about a city that relies on imported grain and copper. In the good years, it makes sense to specialize. You concentrate your fields on profitable crops, tax trade instead of farming, and invest in walls and warehouses instead of building a bigger agricultural hinterland. Why grow everything yourself when the empire's arteries will pump resources in on demand? But specialization is a bet on stability. If the caravans slow down or the ships don't come, your specialization becomes a vulnerability. So the minute people start doubting the system, they start unwinding that bet. Rulers begin hoarding instead of redistributing. Merchants demand payment up front instead of on credit. Workshops that once produced for export pivot to local consumption, or shut down entirely if local demand can't sustain them. Farmers cling to subsistence plots instead of planting surplus for market. The total volume of trade shrinks, and what remains becomes riskier and more expensive. Insurance, in the form of bribes, gifts, and armed escorts, gets baked into every transaction. That has cascading effects. If copper and tin become harder to move, bronze production drops. Fewer weapons, fewer tools, less capacity to build and repair. If luxury trade contracts, palace elites lose a key source of status and revenue. Court factions fight more viciously over the remaining spoils. Succession becomes more dangerous. Civil wars become more tempting. The Amarna letters only let us glimpse this indirectly, through complaints and excuses. A king apologizes that he cannot send the number of horses requested, because his land is poor. Another says he cannot dispatch troops because the roads are unsafe. A vassal insists that he has done his best, but that the men and chariots are not available. Translation: the network is thinning out. What used to be a dense web of mutual dependence starts to look more like scattered threads. A port may still be active, but fewer ships dock there. A caravan route may still exist, but entire stretches are controlled by groups the palace cannot fully command. The old guarantees dissolve into probabilities, and the more fragile the system becomes, the more each participant tries to look out for themselves. There's a brutal irony here. The same high level of integration that made the late Bronze Age world spectacular also made it exquisitely sensitive to disruption. When everything is connected, you can move resources efficiently, but you can also move shock efficiently. A drought that might once have ruined one kingdom can now pull on every cord, reducing surplus in one region, cutting shipments in another, triggering raids along trade routes, forcing garrison withdrawals, emboldening rivals, and so on down the line. We tend to imagine collapses as sudden events, cities burned, palaces looted, invaders pouring through the gates. What the Amarna archive suggests is that, from the inside, collapse often feels like a long, frustrating series of temporary problems that never quite get fixed. One year, the grain is late. The next year, the grain is smaller. Then a caravan goes missing. Then a neighbouring king fails to send the expected troops. Then your own envoys don't come back. At every step, you still assume the old system will reassert itself. Next season, next reign, after the next treaty. But eventually, you wake up and realise the system itself is gone. The rules you thought you were playing by no longer apply. The promise that Egypt will always send grain, that the great kings will always settle disputes, that trade will always resume after a war, those are now stories about a bygone age. For the people writing the Amarna letters, that realization came too late to fix anything. They were trapped in a network whose core assumptions had already failed, still sending tablets to overlords who could no longer deliver what their titles implied. For us, reading them, the pattern is easier to see. When a civilization builds its everyday survival on far-flung, just-in-time flows of food, metal, and security, it is also building a hidden fragility. As long as the network holds, that fragility is invisible. When the connectors falter, when shipments, soldiers, and trust all arrive just a little too late, that fragility suddenly becomes the main character. And by the time everyone starts rewriting their strategies, the reset is already underway. 4. The sea peoples and the collapse of coastal gateways. By the time we get to our next sign, the system isn't just fraying on land. The ocean itself has turned into a battlefield. Historians later gave them a dramatic name, the Sea Peoples. In Egyptian inscriptions, they appear almost like a force of nature. From across the sea, the texts say, their countries were destroyed and scattered in battle. They come with families, ox carts, whole communities on the move, rolling up to the borders of Egypt after slamming into every coastal kingdom in their path. But before we talk about what they did to the ports that fed palace economies, we have to face a more basic question. Who were they? The honest answer is, we don't know for sure. And that uncertainty is part of what makes this episode so unsettling. In a world that thought of itself as ordered, catalogued, and civilized, an entire category of people appeared who did not fit neatly into anyone's archive. The sources we do have are heavily biased. Almost everything we know comes from the people who tried to stop them, especially the Egyptians. Pharaohs like Ramesses III carved triumph scenes showing ships locked in combat, archers firing from decks, foreigners drowning in the waves. Victory propaganda, not neutral reporting. Even the word Sea Peoples is a modern label. The Egyptians never sat down and defined one coherent ethnic group. They listed clusters of names, some with feathered headdresses, some with horned helmets, some with shaved chins, some with beards. The modern term bundles a whole spectrum of identities into one ominous category. So what might actually lie behind that bundle? One camp of scholars sees them as uprooted migrants from the Aegean and Anatolian worlds. On this view, many of these groups originated in areas around Mycenaean Greece, western Anatolia, and the islands of the eastern Mediterranean. When those regions started suffering earthquakes, droughts, or internal wars, parts of their population packed up, took to the sea, and went looking for new land. There are hints that support this. Some of the names in Egyptian inscriptions sound suspiciously like later Greek or Anatolian peoples. The Shurdan might connect to Sardinia, the Shekelish to Sicily, the Iqesh to Achaean Greeks. Weapon styles and helmet designs carved on temple walls sometimes resemble gear found in Aegean archaeological sites from the same period. If this picture is right, what we're seeing isn't just random raiding. It's cascading displacement. One failing region pushes people into the sea, those people hit the next vulnerable coastline, and the shock travels along the entire ring of Bronze Age ports. Another theory emphasizes something different: mercenaries who slipped their leashes. We know from earlier centuries that great kings routinely hired foreign warriors, especially seafaring ones. Egypt, Hatti, and the city-states of Canaan all employed outsiders as shock troops and garrison forces. Some of the very same ethnic labels that later appear as Sea Peoples show up first as elite foreign guards or specialist fighters in royal service. Under this model, the Sea Peoples are what happens when centralized paymasters can no longer reliably pay. Imagine decades of shrinking trade, harder access to bronze, and palace treasuries that no longer overflow with gold from tribute and commerce. Foreign soldiers who once drew rich rations and plunder suddenly face delayed pay, thin rations, and collapsing command structures. Their loyalties, never rooted in local kinship, become negotiable. These troops don't vanish. They look for new employers or start employing themselves. Bands of experienced fighters with ships, weapons, and no strong attachment to any throne begin operating on their own account. Some hire out to local lords, others pivot to piracy. Others, facing famine at home, organize their extended families and try to conquer land outright. On this reading, the Sea Peoples aren't a single migrating nation. They're the military debris of a failing imperial order, recombining into new coalitions as they move from coast to coast. A third line of thinking focuses less on where they came from and more on what pushed so many different groups onto the water at the same time. Climate reconstructions for the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE point to significant drying in parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Tree rings, lake sediments, and pollen records in places like Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant show signs of repeated droughts and failing harvests. Layer that on top of already overextended palace economies, and you get what some scholars call famine migration. Under this scenario, the sea peoples are a patchwork of climate refugees, dispossessed farmers, disgruntled soldiers, and local pirates all thrown into the same blender. Their ships carry not just warriors, but women, children, and livestock, because this isn't a seasonal raid, it's an attempt to relocate entire societies. The Egyptian texts for once line up with this. They describe the lands united in a conspiracy, moving all at once with their families, their hearts confident that they would lay hand upon the whole world. That sounds less like a temporary raid and more like people who have burned their bridges behind them. Of course, these theories aren't mutually exclusive. You can imagine an Aegean palace hit by drought and earthquake, unable to pay its mercenaries, collapsing into civil war. Some warriors seize ships, load their relatives, and sail off. Along the way, they link up with other desperate groups, discharged soldiers from Hittite garrisons, starving coastal villagers, opportunistic pirates, each new addition bringing different skills and different grievances. What begins as scattered local crises coalesces into something that looks, from the vantage point of Egypt and Canaan, like a single onrushing storm. In other words, sea peoples might be less a stable identity and more a temporary alliance formed in the crucible of systemic breakdown. A floating coalition of losers from the old order, trying to carve out a place in a world where the rules had stopped working. And that coalition didn't just raid fields and villages. It went straight for the ocean's equivalent of royal palaces, the coastal gateways that kept the late Bronze Age economy alive. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what those coastal gateways actually were. In our world, we're used to maps covered in borders and flags. But for most of the late Bronze Age, power ran along coastlines and sea lanes. The real arteries of the system weren't the dotted lines between kingdoms. They were the shipping routes between ports. Think of cities like Ugarit, Byblos, Ashkelon, Tyre, and the ports of Cyprus as the processor hubs in a networked computer. The palaces inland, the Hittite court, Egyptian Thebes, the great centres in Syria and Canaan, were the apps running on top. If you knocked out a palace, another king might move in. If you knocked out the ports, the whole operating system froze. Why? Because everything the elites needed flowed through those harbours. Bronze itself is your first clue. The entire military technology of the age, swords, spearheads, chariot fittings, depended on bronze. Bronze needs copper and tin. The eastern Mediterranean had some copper, especially on Cyprus, but almost no tin. That meant tin had to come from far away. Maybe central Anatolia, maybe the Caucasus, maybe as far as Central Asia or beyond. Wherever it came from, it moved by a chain of land routes and, crucially, by ship. Ships brought tin to Cyprus. From Cyprus, other ships carried finished bronze ingots and tools to Levantine and Egyptian ports. From there, caravans hauled them inland to arm chariot corps and palace guards. Break that chain at the sea stage, and it doesn't matter how rich your inland fields are. Your high-status warriors start fighting with worn-out gear. Your blacksmiths have nothing to work with. Your palace loses not just military edge but prestige, because bronze weapons and glittering metal gifts are the language of diplomacy. And bronze was just one thread. Those ports also handled bulk staples no single kingdom could produce in the quantities it wanted. Grain from more fertile river valleys, olive oil and wine from specialized agricultural zones, timber from forested mountain slopes, horses from inland plains, luxury items from far beyond the horizon, ivory, glass, purple dye, exotic woods, rare pigments. The palace economy was built on being the spider at the center of this web. Rulers collected grain, oil, metal, and finished goods as tribute or trade, then redistributed them to officials, soldiers, craftsmen, and foreign allies. That redistribution wasn't charity, it was the mechanism that kept loyalty glued together. If the ship carrying your year's supply of Cypriot copper and Canaanite oil doesn't arrive, that balance falters fast. You can't pay your elites in gifts. You can't reward your soldiers with plunder shares of imported luxury goods. You can't keep your craftsmen busy in the palace workshops, turning raw materials into items that advertise your greatness. So why were the ports and sea lanes such perfect targets for the kinds of coalitions we lump together as sea peoples? For one thing, geography squeezes ships into predictable paths. Wind patterns and currents in the eastern Mediterranean are not random. Sailors in the Late Bronze Age followed coast-hugging routes, hopping from harbour to harbour, anchoring in known coves, stopping at traditional way stations for fresh water and repairs. There were choke points you simply couldn't avoid. Narrow straits, cape crossings, island channels. You don't need satellites to interdict a system like that. You just need enough ships and enough desperation. Combine that with the structure of the ports themselves. Late Bronze Age harbours were not anonymous, decentralised markets. They were extensions of palace power. Warehouses, dock facilities, customs offices, temples that took their share of incoming cargo, all of it monitored by royal scribes and overseers. That made them rich. It also made them brittle. If you're a coalition of displaced warriors and migrants, staring at famine at your back and guarded storehouses ahead, where do you aim? You don't waste energy fighting every village along the coast. You go for the few nodes where food, metal and valuables are concentrated, and where the navy and army are supposed to be based. Hit those places, and you're not just stealing grain. You're punching holes in the logistical lungs of entire kingdoms. Another vulnerability was seasonal predictability. Bronze Age rulers timed their campaigns, tax collection and grain shipments around the agricultural and sailing calendars. Letters from this period are full of complaints. Ships delayed because the winds were wrong, convoys waiting for the right season, merchants held back until the seas were safe. Everyone knew when the shipping lanes were busiest and when the big valuable fleets would be on the water. Now imagine a loose alliance of seafaring groups who don't need to protect fixed infrastructure, who can up anchor and move in a night, who aren't tied to sowing and harvest cycles inland. For them, those predictable peaks in traffic are hunting season. Ports also concentrated information. If you wanted to know what was happening 3 kingdoms away, whether a rival king had died, whether prices were rising, whether some region was on the brink of famine, you didn't ask a farmer. You asked a ship captain or a merchant. Harbours were data centres. Gossip, diplomatic reports and economic intelligence all flowed through them. Cut those hubs, and you don't just lose goods, you lose situational awareness. This is where the analogy to modern choke points becomes uncomfortable. Today it's the Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, major container terminals. Then it was narrow straits, island harbours and city ports. In both cases, a handful of locations carry a wildly disproportionate share of the system's throughput. When those locations become contested, whether by blockades, piracy or war, the rest of the network feels it almost immediately. And remember, this wasn't a world with highly redundant routing. If a major late Bronze Age port went offline, there wasn't a convenient alternate harbour with equal capacity a few miles down the coast. There were stretches with minor anchorages, yes, but the big depots, the ones with storage, shipyards, protective garrisons, were relatively few. That scarcity amplified the damage any coordinated maritime disruption could do. So when a mix of migrants, mercenaries and pirates started attacking, bypassing or outright conquering those hubs, they weren't just raiding rich cities. They were twisting shut the valves that kept the entire imperial ecosystem pressurized. And the rulers on land, who had grown used to seeing the sea as a highway for tribute and luxury, suddenly had to confront a darker possibility that the very medium which had made their wealth possible could also become an engine of collapse. Once those valves started to close, the really dangerous part wasn't the first shortages. It was everything that happened next, because big palace systems don't fail like light switches. They fail like power grids. One line goes down, the load shifts. Other lines overheat, and suddenly you're sitting in the dark wondering how a single failure cascaded into a blackout. The first visible cracks probably looked manageable. A missed convoy here, a lost shipment there. A king writes a letter complaining that the copper hasn't arrived, that the merchants are delayed, that the roads and the seas are not safe. Scribes invent excuses. Local officials raid emergency stores to cover shortfalls. Temples lend grain to the palace with the expectation it'll be paid back after the next harvest or the next successful trading season. But if the sea peoples or other maritime predators like them keep hitting the roots, those temporary fixes don't reset the system. They drain its buffers, start with the military, chariot corps, elite infantry, garrison soldiers along the coast. All of them depend on imported gear and centralized logistics. You can't maintain a specialized warrior class if you can't reliably pay them in food, land, and prestige items. Lose a few shipments of bronze and luxury goods, and your best fighters start asking hard questions. If they don't get answers, they start freelancing, extorting the countryside, switching allegiance to rival kings, or even joining the very raiding coalitions that are strangling your ports. So the state responds the only way it knows how. It militarizes the problem. Rulers divert resources from long-distance trade into coastal defense. More ships for patrols, more troops garrisoned in harbor towns. Emergency fortifications. That sounds like a solution, but it's actually a trade-off. Every sack of grain and batch of copper going to the navy is a sack and batch not going to farmers, craftsmen, or provincial elites. You're cannibalizing your own economy to defend what's left of it. Meanwhile, inland, the knock-on effects multiply. Those palace redistribution systems we talked about were never just about feeding people. They choreographed entire social hierarchies. Scribes, bronze workers, leather workers, chariot builders, builders of monumental architecture, all of them are plugged into the palace as their main customer. Cut the flow of imported inputs, and the workshops run out of work. Specialized craftsmen lose their purpose and their rations. Some starve, some return to subsistence agriculture if they can. Some drift to fringe activities, banditry, mercenary work, joining migrant bands looking for more stable food sources. The system begins to despecialize. That has long-term consequences. It took generations to build up those craft traditions, the skill of a chariot wheelwright or a master bronze caster. Lose them even for a couple of decades, and you're not just poor now. You've lost the ability to easily climb back to the same level of complexity later. At the same time, provincial governors and local elites are watching the centre misfire. As coastal gateways clog, tax shipments become irregular. The palace starts demanding the same quotas from the countryside, while delivering fewer goods in return. That breaks the implied contract. Send us surplus and obedience, and we'll send you metal, prestige, and military protection. If caravans from the ports stop arriving, but the royal tax collectors don't, loyalty thins fast. In some regions, local leaders likely decided to keep more for themselves, hoarding grain, seizing control of regional shrines, backing away from the king's authority. Elsewhere, angry farmers and townspeople might have simply revolted when shortages bit too hard. Now combine that with environmental stress. We know the late Bronze Age collapse coincides with evidence for drought in parts of the eastern Mediterranean. In a stable, well-fed system with full granaries and robust trade, a few dry years are painful but survivable. In a system where coastal choke points are already malfunctioning, those dry years become accelerants. Ships that do make it through are no longer carrying nice-to-have luxuries. They're carrying life-or-death grain shipments. If those get intercepted or delayed, entire cities face famine. And famine doesn't just kill quietly, it erodes legitimacy. What good is a god-king who can't make the ships arrive? Why should you worship the state's gods if their temples are empty? When officials tell you to trust the system, but your children are starving, you look elsewhere for food, for meaning, for leaders. That's where migrants and raiders stop being just external threats and start becoming alternative systems. If a band of seaborne warriors shows up offering food from a captured granary in exchange for fighters and loyalty, some desperate people say yes. If an inland group of displaced farmers heads toward the coast because they've heard rumours of ships with grain, they're both victims and vectors of the breakdown. Suddenly, you're not just dealing with piracy, you're dealing with population movements, refugee flows, and ad hoc coalitions of the hungry and the armed, all moving along the same corridors that once carried tin and wine. Each wave of disruption makes the ports less reliable, which makes inland centres more brittle, which makes more people desperate enough to join the next wave of disruption. That's what a feedback loop looks like. In the records of future centuries, you don't see a clear line between sea peoples and locals. You see new ethnic labels, new political formations, new settlements built on the ruins of old port cities and palace complexes. The coastal gateways that once funneled wealth to a few great courts become contested frontiers for smaller, rougher powers. And here's the uncomfortable echo. Our world runs on its own coastal gateways and maritime choke points. Container ports, fuel terminals, critical canals and straits. They too are intertwined with inland financial systems, political legitimacy, and the everyday food security of millions. When those routes are disrupted even briefly, prices spike, shelves empty, governments scramble to reassure everyone that it's fine, it's under control. In the late Bronze Age, it wasn't under control. The rulers at the top couldn't rewire their economies fast enough. They had built a civilization optimized for smooth, predictable flows along narrow maritime arteries. When those arteries clogged under the combined pressure of climate stress, migration and maritime violence, the system didn't bend. It fractured. Coastal gateways that had once been symbols of unstoppable connectivity became bottlenecks of collapse. And in the ashes of those failed networks, the next phase of the reset cycle was already forming, new powers, new trade routes, and new vulnerabilities waiting for the next disruption to expose them. 5. Assyrian, Empire Overshoot, under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. By the time the Assyrians stepped fully onto the stage, the world had reassembled itself after that last reset. New empires, new trade routes, new ways of extracting wealth from land and people. But underneath, the pattern was the same. Whoever could control flows of grain, silver, soldiers' information could pretend they controlled history. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, especially under kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, pushed that logic farther than almost anyone before them. If the late Bronze Age palace states were complex, Assyria was complexity with teeth. Their answer to the chaos of previous centuries was simple and brutal. Don't just influence your neighbours. Occupy them. Don't just tax them, gut them, rebuild them, and plug them directly into your own system. To make that work across thousands of kilometres, they needed more than just scary armies. They needed infrastructure and administration powerful enough to turn conquest into a permanent operating system. So they built a machine. At its core was tribute. If you were a subject kingdom or a client city, your relationship to Assyria was measured in deliveries. Grain, livestock, timber from distant mountains, metals, luxury textiles, exotic animals, hostages, royal daughters sent as brides. Every year loaded caravans and river barges had to move toward Assyrian heartland cities like Nineveh, Ashur and Kalhu. This wasn't just random looting, it was scheduled extraction. Scribes in the capital tracked quotas on clay tablets. How much silver from here, how much cedar from there, how many horses, how many soldiers as auxiliary troops. Royal inscriptions bragged about tribute lists with almost accounting-like precision. So many talents of gold, so many chariots, so many captives. For provincial governors, meeting those quotas was everything. Hit the numbers, and you kept your job, your land, your status. Fall short, and you risked inspection, punishment, or being replaced by someone more ruthless. Tribute wasn't only about wealth, it was about hierarchy. Every caravan that arrived at the capital was a physical reminder that dozens of different peoples and cities were now plugged into a single vertical chain of command. To keep that chain tight, the Assyrians did something else that earlier empires had only dabbled in. They wired their territory with roads. Not just paths, roads. Royal highways linked the core cities in northern Mesopotamia to distant provinces in Syria, Anatolia, the Levant, even down toward Egypt for a time. These roads weren't open, neutral infrastructure like a modern freeway. They were instruments of imperial control. Way stations and relay posts were placed along major routes to host royal messengers and military couriers. The Assyrians developed a relay system that could move information across their empire in days instead of weeks. A governor on the frontier couldn't pretend the king hadn't heard yet about a rebellion or a late shipment. News moved too fast. On these same roads, tribute flowed inward and troops flowed outward. When a city resisted, that road became the artery down which an army would march with siege engines, supplies, and siege specialists in tow. When a city submitted, that road became the corridor through which its wealth was siphoned and its elites were summoned to court to swear loyalty. And where roads went, garrisons followed. The Assyrians understood that fear fades if it isn't made visible, so they stationed troops everywhere that mattered, at key junctions, in conquered capitals, along trade routes, beside border passes, around major temples and storage depots. These weren't always huge armies, sometimes just enough soldiers to remind locals that Assyria was watching. But even a small permanent military presence could tilt local politics. A friendly faction in a city knew they had Assyrian steel at their back. A hostile faction knew any misstep could trigger a punitive expedition. Governors didn't simply rule for Assyria, they ruled knowing that an Assyrian garrison could be both bodyguard and execution squad, depending on how well they served the centre. Garrisons also had another function. They were enforcement nodes for deportation and resettlement. When the Assyrians crushed a rebellion, they didn't just take loot and leave. They uprooted tens of thousands of people, craftsmen, soldiers, entire families, and moved them to other parts of the empire. Garrison towns helped receive and guard these deportees, plugging them into new economic roles, often far from their homeland, where they were less likely to revolt again. From the capital's perspective, this whole setup looked almost elegant. Tribute mapped who owed what, roads connected everyone to the centre. Garrisons enforced loyalty on the ground. Governors and local kings became interchangeable managers inside a single imperial spreadsheet. To a king like Esarhaddon, this must have felt like a solved problem. You conquer, you integrate, you watch the flows increase. If someone resists, you march down your own imperial highway and remind them who built it. But a system that depends on precise, constant movement of goods, people and fear has its own kind of fragility. Because once you've optimized everything for rapid extraction and rapid response, You've also made it exquisitely sensitive to anything that slows the roads, interrupts the tribute, or distracts the garrisons. And under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, as the empire reached its greatest geographic extent, those hidden stresses began to multiply. Perpetual empire sounds glorious in inscriptions. On the balance sheet, it's something else. Because that beautiful humming machine of tribute, roads and garrisons only worked under one non-negotiable condition. The king had to be constantly terrifying. Not just strong, not just competent, visibly, relentlessly, almost ritualistically violent. Campaign season wasn't an exception. It was the operating system. Every year, as soon as conditions allowed, the king was expected to go out to war. It's in the inscriptions like a refrain. Against rebellious provinces, against rival kingdoms, against nomadic groups on the frontier, against whoever looked even slightly like they might be a problem next year. A quiet frontier wasn't a sign that you could relax. It was a sign that you should raid farther, because tribute had two sources. One was the regular scheduled flow from existing subjects. The other was the irregular, spectacular inflow from new campaigns, war booty, confiscated lands, a fresh wave of deported labourers. If that second stream slowed down, everything else started to creak. Ashurbanipal's libraries, palaces and reliefs weren't paid for by some magical internal surplus. They were paid for by layering fresh conquest revenue on top of structurally extracted tribute. It's like running a company where you don't just need steady sales, you also need to keep buying and flipping new companies every year, or your cash flow collapses. And conquest has a nasty habit. The easy wins come first. By the time Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal are on the throne, Assyria has already chewed through most of the low-hanging fruit. Nearby city-states with rich hinterlands, subdued. Trade corridors in Syria and along the Mediterranean, under control. Weak neighbours, absorbed, deported, garrisoned. What's left are the hard targets, Egypt, with its own ancient state machinery and deep resources. The Elamite kingdom to the east, prickly and persistent. Mountain zones full of small, stubborn polities that never stay quiet for long. So the king has to go farther, stay out longer, and pour more resources into each campaign, just to maintain the same psychological effect on the empire. Assyria is unstoppable, submission is rational, rebellion is suicide. That effect was priceless, but it was also fragile and expensive to renew. When Esarhaddon marched into Egypt, it wasn't just about glory. It was messaging to every governor and client king from Anatolia to the Gulf. Look how far the king's arm can reach. Look what happens to those who resist. But an Egyptian campaign is logistically brutal. Long supply lines, disease, local resistance, rival elites who don't simply vanish when you topple a pharaoh. Every extra month the king's main army is stuck in the Nile Delta is a month when frontier garrisons are stretched thinner, governors have more room to scheme, neighbouring powers watch, calculate, and whisper to your vassals. Maybe Assyria is overextended inside the empire. The costs mount too. Those constant campaigns suck up able-bodied men from the countryside. Farmers become soldiers, fields go untilled, or are worked by fewer hands. The very provinces that pay your tribute are being drained to fuel the wars that are supposed to guarantee that tribute. Archaeology from some Assyrian provinces shows signs of settlement contraction and stress late in the empire's life. It's not easy to disentangle causes, climate, war, internal exactions, but the underlying pattern is pretty clear. The edges are being squeezed hard to feed the centre, and the centre has its own appetite. Royal courts under Ashurbanipal didn't get simpler. They got more elaborate, more officials, more scribes, more specialist artisans, more luxury imports. more temples expecting donations in return for divine favor. All of that is fixed cost. Once you've built a capital like Nineveh into a glittering propaganda engine, you can't just quietly dial it down when the war booty slows. Everyone in that ecosystem expects the flows to continue. That's the structural side of Overshoot. But the really volatile ingredient in this mix is something else: succession. Because this whole war as maintenance model depends on one person being simultaneously generalissimo, chief judge, high priest, and terror-in-chief. And that person is mortal. Esarhaddon knew this. He'd watched his own father, Sennacherib, get assassinated, probably by one or more of his sons, inside a temple. The empire didn't just face foreign enemies, it faced its own princes. So when Esarhaddon came to power after a vicious civil war with his brothers, he tried to engineer stability from the top down. He issued loyalty oaths to officials and subject kings, not just in his own name, but in favour of his chosen heirs. We have copies of these oaths, long, detailed curses calling down horrible fates on anyone who breaks faith with Esarhaddon's sons. It was an attempt to pre-program the succession, to make the transition from one king to the next as automatic and fear-saturated as tribute collection. From the centre's perspective, this is genius. You hard-code elite loyalty into the system. You make every governor and vassal swear that when the old king dies, they'll obey the new one without hesitation. But look at it from another angle. The mere fact that Esarhaddon needed such extreme oaths tells us just how unstable the upper layers had become. The empire wasn't a calm, orderly machine. It was a cage full of ambitious predators who had to be constantly reminded that clawing at the bars would bring divine annihilation. Then there's the succession design itself. Esarhaddon split his inheritance. Ashurbanipal would rule Assyria and the core empire. Another son would rule Babylon. On paper, this was a clever way to diffuse tension between the Assyrian and Babylonian elites. In practice, it created overlapping spheres of power, rival courts, and a permanent question mark. Where does real authority end and client-king autonomy begin? Every time a great king got sick, or even just seemed weakened, every governor, every frontier commander, every neighbouring king started doing mental math. If the next guy is weaker, if the succession isn't clean, if the army is tied down far away, maybe this is the moment to cut the tribute, back a rival prince, or quietly prepare a fortress for siege. You can see the tension in the texts. Royal inscriptions brag loudly about crushing rebels, punishing oath breakers, restoring order. The louder the proclamations, the more you can sense the underlying anxiety. The king knows how much depends on no one smelling weakness. But no lineage can keep producing hyper-competent war celebrities forever. There are bad harvests of kings too, and once you've built an empire that only stays balanced while the crown keeps marching, keeps winning, and keeps scaring everyone enough to keep the tribute flowing, a single uncertain transition at the top can send shockwaves through the whole structure, because the campaigns don't just project strength outward. They're also how the king rides the roads, inspects the garrisons, listens to rumours, and reminds every local power whose name is on the oaths. Stop marching for too long, and suddenly the machine starts running on memory and fear alone. Memories fade, fear decays. Meanwhile, costs don't. So what happens when the marching slows or stops? You don't get a gentle glide down. You get something closer to a stall. From the outside, Assyria at its peak looks invincible. Huge armies, shock campaigns to the Nile and the mountains, terror carved in stone. But that very peak is a kind of cliff edge, because the empire is now so large, so complex, and so dependent on one man's momentum that small disruptions at the top propagate far. Esarhaddon dies on campaign, on the road to Egypt. The succession he tried to script mostly works. Ashurbanipal ends up on the throne in Nineveh, his brother in Babylon. The oaths hold. The empire doesn't immediately fly apart. On the surface, that looks like a success story. Underneath, the cracks are widening. Ashurbanipal is everything the system wants. Literate, pious, militarily effective. He crushes rebellions, humiliates Egypt, obliterates Elam so thoroughly that later writers say its kingship ceased to exist. The reliefs show rivers choked with corpses, enemy cities pulled down to their foundations. This is imperial Overshoot in action. The message is clear: no rival will be tolerated. No buffer will be allowed to remain dangerous. Every problem must be solved with maximum force. But when you erase entire neighbour states, you're also erasing shock absorbers. Independent Elam, for example, had been a perennial nuisance for Assyria. Raids, alliances with Babylon, occasional wars. Annoying, but also useful. A rival that could be played off against other rivals. Once Ashurbanipal is done, there's just a hole on the map. A depopulated zone, ruined cities, traumatized populations, power vacuums. No tax-paying king, no established elite you can negotiate with, just rubble and resentful survivors. Multiply that logic. Every time Assyria solves a frontier by extreme violence, it pushes the edge of the empire into rougher terrain, poorer hinterlands, more scattered populations. The tribute potential per mile of frontier falls, but the cost of garrisons and campaigning doesn't. You've expanded your risk envelope without proportionally expanding your revenue base. Inside the empire, something similar is happening socially. Those loyalty oaths that once bound elites become weapons in factional struggles. Accusations of oath-breaking, treason, secret sympathy with rebels, all are grounds for spectacular punishment. Heads roll, families are wiped out, estates are confiscated. Short-term, this concentrates wealth and power in the king's hands. Long-term, it hollows out the middle tiers of trusted, competent officials who actually make the system run. And all the while, the empire is generating its own enemies. Every deported population remembers who uprooted them. Every province squeezed by emergency levies remembers which king drained its grain, and sons for some distant war. When Ashurbanipal ages or falls ill, those memories don't just vanish. They stack. We don't have a single clean narrative of what historians sometimes call Assyria's big collapse moment. The sources get thinner, more local, more confused. But if you zoom out, a pattern emerges. You see simultaneous stressors hitting a system already stretched past its design limits. There are internal revolts and regional uprisings. Babylon refuses to stay pacified forever. Vassal kings hedge their bets, playing at loyalty while quietly probing for exits. Frontier peoples regroup in the cracks left by earlier devastations. There are probably environmental factors too. Evidence hints at regional droughts and harvest failures in parts of the Near East in the late 7th century BCE. Even modest climate wobble can become catastrophic when your countryside is already exhausted by decades of levies and requisitions. And crucially, there are new coalitions of enemies. The Medes in the Iranian plateau, the Neo-Babylonian dynasty rising again in the south. Various groups who individually had never been able to face Assyria head-on now find each other and compare notes. From their perspective, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The great king's aura of invincibility has dimmed. Campaigns are harder to sustain. Succession is no longer a solved problem. It's a recurring crisis. The empire's military still exists, but it is pulled in too many directions, defending too long a perimeter, guarding too many resentful cities. So when the blows finally land, the sieges of cities like Ashur, Kalhu and Nineveh, they land on a structure that has already lost much of its internal cohesion. When Nineveh falls in 612 BCE, it shocks the region. Later stories talk about it like a divine judgment, a sudden, total catastrophe. But from the perspective of system dynamics, it looks less like a lightning strike and more like a long-rotted beam finally snapping. Overshoot, then collapse. At the peak, Assyria seemed to have everything under control. Wealth, knowledge, administrative sophistication, terrifying military power. But its basic survival strategy, perpetual expansion, centralized terror, extraction piled on extraction, had no built-in break, no safe mode, no graceful way to shrink. Once expansion ceased to be cheap and easy, the same mechanisms that had made the empire work began to tear it apart. And here's where the Sumerian reset cycle comes back into focus. After Assyria goes, the map doesn't stay empty. New powers step into the vacuum. Babylon rises again, the Medes, and then Persians build their own empires. The rivers still flow, fields are replanted, temples are reconsecrated, but the memory of what an empire can do and what it can demand lingers. Each new regime inherits the tools, the roads, the administrative tricks, and also the blind spots. Each one thinks it can avoid overshoot. Each one rides the same curve, consolidation, expansion, strain, and then, sooner or later, some version of collapse. Assyria's story is not just about ancient kings being too brutal. It's about what happens when a civilization's operating system depends on permanent escalation, when stability requires constant demonstrations of strength, and when any pause looks like weakness. In that kind of system, peak power is not the opposite of vulnerability. It's the moment just before the fall 6, the late antique Justinian Plague and urban shock. If the Assyrians show us collapse driven from the top down, the next case shows us what happens when the hammer falls from below. Not invading armies, not palace coups. Fleas, historians call it the Justinianic Plague, after the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian Vorfahrf. But that name is misleading. It makes it sound like a single event, neatly boxed in time. There was a plague, lots of people died, and then it was over. The evidence says something very different. What we can see, peering through fragmentary chronicles and scattered bones, looks more like a series of waves pounding the same shoreline for generations. You're in Constantinople in the 540s CE. It's still one of the great cities of the world. Marble colonnades, vast cisterns, bustling harbours funneling grain and taxes from 3 continents. Then the stories say the sickness arrives. Chroniclers talk about ships bringing grain from Egypt and North Africa. They also talk about rats and worms, probably fleas. But they don't know what a bacterium is. All they know is that people start developing swellings, fevers, delirium, and then they die. Some texts give numbers that sound impossible, tens of thousands a day. Half the city, 2/3 of it. Modern historians don't take those figures literally, but they don't dismiss them either. Exaggeration is still evidence. It tells us how overwhelming it felt. The pattern across the sources is consistent. They talk about bodies piling up faster than they can be buried, mass graves dug in hillsides, churches and houses turned into temporary morgues, corpses ferried out by cart and boat because there is simply no space left. And then silence. A gap in the record. Fewer legal documents. Fewer inscriptions. Whole stretches of bureaucratic paperwork just thin out. This is where the bones start speaking. Archaeologists have been going back to late antique cemeteries across the Mediterranean and Near East, looking for patterns. They don't find giant plague pits everywhere. This isn't medieval Europe with famous Black Death trenches in every textbook. Instead, they see subtler shifts. In some regions, there's a sudden spike in burials clustered around the mid-6th century. Graveyards that had been used at a steady, modest rate for decades suddenly see many more interments, packed into a short span of years. You see graves overlapping, hasty burials with less care put into grave goods or orientation, bodies squeezed into the remaining spaces of long-used cemeteries, as if people are dying faster than ritual can keep up. In other places you see something eerie, abrupt abandonment. A cemetery that had served a village or town for generations just stops being used. No more burials, occupational layers in that area thin out or end. Nearby, a much smaller burial ground starts up, with fewer individuals. It looks like populations shrank, communities fragmented, and some sites were simply given up. Crucially, the written and skeletal data line up in time. The first big reported outbreak hits Constantinople around 541-542 CE and spreads through the empire over the next few years. In the decades that follow, chronicles from Syria, Egypt, Italy and Gaul mention recurring pestilences. Not one plague, but many. You see similar pulses in the burial record. In some regions there are at least 2 or 3 distinct mortality spikes within a century. Graves dated by pottery styles, coins or radiocarbon cluster around these decades. It matches what you'd expect from a pathogen that keeps reappearing in a partially immune, partially vulnerable population, and it doesn't only hit cities. Textual sources tend to focus on big urban centres and famous people, because that's who writes and who gets written about. But the cemetery evidence says the countryside suffered too. In rural areas of the eastern Mediterranean, you find small village graveyards that suddenly get crowded, then empty out. Strontium and oxygen isotope analysis on teeth, which can track where a person grew up, shows population turnover. Local lines break, newcomers appear, then they too vanish from the record. It paints a picture of demographic whiplash, survivors moving to fill gaps, families relocating after losing landholders, migrants from one stricken region arriving in another that is about to be hit in its own turn. When you zoom out, you see a larger pattern. Late antique cities across the empire, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, Carthage, all show signs of being overbuilt for the shrunken populations that occupy them by the 7th century. Vast water systems maintained for fewer users, public buildings partially abandoned or repurposed, neighbourhoods contracting into defensible cores while outer districts decay. The chronicles don't say, our tax base has collapsed because of repeated plague waves. They talk instead about God's judgment, strange portents in the sky, the sins of rulers and people. But alongside those moral explanations, they keep mentioning familiar scenes: deserted streets, closed shops, a shortage of workers, empty houses being taken over by whoever is left. From their point of view, this is not just sickness. It's a slow-motion unmaking of urban life. And here's where the Sumerian reset cycle lens becomes useful again. Because once you start reading these chronicles against the graves in the ground, you realize the empire isn't just experiencing a health crisis. Its entire way of concentrating people, wealth and power into dense, interdependent urban hubs is being stress-tested in real time, and the weak points start to glow. Think about what made Constantinople or Alexandria or Antioch powerful in the first place. They were machines for turning grain into gold and bodies into bureaucracy. You pull in taxes from a huge hinterland, channel them through ports and warehouses, and use them to pay soldiers, officials and priests. As long as the flow is steady, the machine hums. Now start pulling cogs out of that machine at random. Every plague wave doesn't just kill people in the abstract. It kills dockworkers who unload grain ships, muleteers who move tax in kind from inland estates, notaries who record contracts, sailors who ferry troops, mid-level administrators who actually know how the local tax registers work. We don't have spreadsheets of lost accountants 543 CE, But we do have hints. In the law codes and papyri that survive, you see emergency measures. Reissued tax demands because earlier ones weren't fulfilled. Reassignments of land because owners are dead or estates have no heirs. Imperial edicts complaining that local elites are dodging public obligations, refusing to serve as city councillors, fleeing their posts. It looks like a state trying to run the same size system with a smaller, more exhausted caste. Imagine you're a landowner in Egypt during one of these waves. Half your labour force has just died. The survivors are traumatised and know they're suddenly valuable. They can demand better terms, or they can simply walk away to an underworked estate up the Nile. Your harvest drops, but the tax quota set by a distant bureaucracy hasn't adjusted yet. Officials still expect grain or money or both, so you underdeclare. You bribe, you neglect marginal fields because there's no one to work them. Multiply that across thousands of estates, and the imperial budget starts bleeding out. You can see the knock-on effect in military logistics. The Eastern Roman Empire of Justinian's day is still trying to play great power games, reconquering Italy, holding on to North Africa, facing Persia in the east, watching the Balkans in the north. That kind of posture depends on being able to recruit, feed, and move armies reliably. But armies march on grain and coin, and both are suddenly in shorter supply. Procopius, who actually served with Justinian's generals, complains about troops going unpaid, about mutinies, about soldiers deserting to avoid dying for a cause that no longer seems to feed them. Later sources talk about frontier fortresses understaffed, garrisons reduced, defensive lines thinning out. It isn't that the plague destroyed the army in one blow. It's more subtle. Each wave removes a slice of the primage male population. Some of those would have been recruits. Others were officers with decades of experience, the people who knew the terrain, the supply routes, the local languages. Training new men takes years. Training new institutional memory takes generations. Meanwhile, the empire is forced into triage. Do you keep all the frontier posts manned, or do you abandon some to save others? Do you keep expensive fleets at sea, or let piracy and raiding slowly increase? Do you continue ambitious building projects, or divert the money to emergency food distributions inside the capital? Time and again you see emperors pulling levers that suggest scarcity. Justinian hikes certain taxes while cancelling others. He centralizes grain control. Later rulers debase currency. Bishops complain in letters that charitable funds are exhausted because there are simply too many widows, orphans, and landless poor. This is what disease does to a complex economy. It turns every fixed cost into a crushing burden. Aqueducts, walls, and harbours were built for a city of maybe 500,000. Now, maybe 2/3 of that, you still have to maintain the infrastructure, but fewer taxpayers are carrying the load. So maintenance gets patchy. Repairs are delayed. One earthquake, one flood, one fire hits a neglected section, and suddenly entire districts go without water or protection. Urban life becomes more fragile, more expensive, less attractive. The countryside feels the strain too. With fewer hands, marginal lands go out of cultivation. Terraces crumble. Irrigation channels silt up. Grain prices become more volatile because surpluses are thinner. A bad harvest that would have been a nuisance in a densely peopled, diversified system now tips quickly into famine in some regions. And famine and disease are old allies. Malnourished bodies are easier prey for infection. Plague waves that might have been less deadly in a well-fed population hit harder in communities already weakened by previous crises and ongoing food insecurity. The state tries to compensate by leaning harder on what's left. There are petitions begging for tax relief after pestilence and desolation. There are complaints about forced labour on imperial building projects. There are signs that former free peasants are being tied more tightly to estates, drifting towards serf-like status as landlords and officials scramble to lock in surviving workers. That's another way disease reshapes an economy. It can freeze mobility at the exact moment people most need options. Some historians argue that this tightening of control is one of the early steps toward the more rigid, localized economies of the early medieval period. Less long-distance trade, more self-sufficient estates, fewer truly urban jobs, more power concentrated in whoever can still muster labour and protection on a local scale. When you view it through the reset cycle lens, what you see is not simply decline, but reconfiguration. An empire built on dense, monetized, highly specialized cities is being forced toward a different equilibrium. Fewer people, fewer big markets, more emphasis on subsistence and local ties. The fiscal and military machinery that once projected Roman power from Britain to Mesopotamia is creaking under the weight of its own fixed costs and falling inputs. And all of this, remember, is happening while the shocks keep coming. Because the Justinianic Plague is not a one-and-done event. It's a recurring background threat that keeps ambushing any attempt at recovery, any effort to restaff the bureaucracy, refill the tax rolls, or rebuild supply chains, like trying to refill a bathtub while someone keeps opening the drain. This is where the timeline gets deceptive. Read a narrative history and it can feel like plague hits in the 540s, empire reels, by the 560s Justinian is building again, game over. 10, 20, 30 years in a book is a chapter. In real life, it's a lifetime. And when a system as complex as late Roman urbanism takes a hit, one lifetime isn't enough. Think about how long it takes just to grow a new human who can replace a lost specialist. A scribe who understands tax law and land tenure and local custom didn't wake up with all that in his head at 18. He grew up watching his father and uncles. He apprenticed. He learned the quirks of each village, which families always paid late, which boundaries were disputed. That knowledge is like a coral reef, built up layer by layer, year by year, across generations. A plague wave doesn't just kill the coral, it kills the reef builders. The children who would have grown into experienced administrators, ship captains, master craftsmen, bishops, legal experts, midwives, city councillors, many of them are simply never born because their parents died young or never had as many children. Demographers call this lost births, and over centuries it can matter more than the initial death toll. Even if a later generation wants to restore the old complexity, there just aren't enough people with the right skills at the right ages in the right places. Now add in psychology. If you survived 2 or 3 plague waves as a child and watched entire neighbourhoods vanish, how eager are you to move back into a dense, crowded city? Urban life in the Roman world was already a gamble. Fires, riots, food shortages. Add a horror story your grandparents still tell in detail. Corpses piled in streets, carts carrying bodies day and night, mass graves outside the walls, and suddenly the bright lights of the capital look less like opportunity and more like a death trap. So people hedge. Wealthy families buy rural villas and spend more time there. They invest in local churches and monasteries instead of municipal offices. Artisans relocate to small towns closer to estates and military posts. Once those choices are made, they harden. Children grow up thinking of the countryside or the fortified hilltop as home, not the old civic centre with its forums and theatres. Urban populations can technically recover in the statistics, but the social imagination has shifted away from the city as the obvious heart of civilization. On top of that, you have inertia baked into the physical environment. If an aqueduct collapses, and no one has the money or workforce to rebuild it to its former scale, the city it served shrinks to match the new carrying capacity. Once a section of port silt is left uncleared, shipping routes adjust, merchants favour a different harbour, warehouses decay. After a generation or two, the old infrastructure isn't just neglected, it's unknown. No living person remembers it functioning at full strength. Rebuilding at that point isn't maintenance, it's reinvention. And reinvention has to compete with all the other urgent demands of a world still in crisis. Frontier defence, religious conflicts, new migrating peoples, shifting climate patterns. Plague doesn't create those challenges, but it steals the surplus energy that might have solved them. That's why historians talk about the Justinianic period as an inflection point, rather than a single cataclysm. Eastern Rome doesn't collapse in 541. The coins still get minted. The laws still get written. Armies still march, but the empire's internal engine has lost horsepower, and every subsequent hill, Persian wars, Balkan incursions, Slavic settlements, Arab conquests, forces it to downshift. When the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean finally look, on paper, medieval rather than Roman, it's tempting to pin that on one dramatic sack or siege. Yet in the background you have a century and a half of demographic erosion, institutional amnesia and cautious behaviour by survivors who no longer trust density, risk or ambition. This is what we mean by recovery taking generations. It's not that no one tries to rebuild within a decade or two. It's that the people doing the rebuilding are fewer, poorer, more traumatized, and often working with a younger, less experienced talent pool. They inherit grand blueprints drawn for a world of abundance and have to keep redrawing them down and down and down. Now bring it forward, modern societies like to believe that if a pandemic hits, there'll be a vaccine in 18 months, an economic stimulus in 24, and by year 5 we'll be back to normal. Maybe at a shallow level, stock indices up, flights full, streets busy again. But the deeper layers, the missing children never conceived, the businesses never reopened, the careers that never started, the expertise that quietly retired early, the trust that evaporated in institutions, those are generational wounds. When you look at the Justinianic Plague, you're seeing the long half-life of shock in a complex system. Not a clean break, but a long, uneven glide path into a different equilibrium. Fewer and smaller cities, more local power, less imperial reach, a narrower tax base trying to support oversized monuments from a previous age. In other words, a classic reset pattern. The old urban imperial operating system becomes too heavy for the underlying hardware, the actual people to run. The system doesn't crash overnight. It lags, stutters, freezes in some places, reboots in others with fewer features enabled. And that's the uncomfortable lesson for us. If our own dense, globally networked cities ever take a comparable demographic and psychological hit, the biggest danger may not be the first wave you see on the news. It may be the slow, quiet realization, 10, 20, 50 years later, that some of the things we once took for granted about what normal civilization looks like simply never came back. By the time you notice that, you're already living in the next version of the system. The reset has finished installing. You just didn't get a pop-up asking for permission. 7. The Dark Age. After 1200 BCE, literacy and craft declines. Up to now we've been talking about collapses where the system limps on, bruised but recognizable. Cities shrink, empires downshift, institutions hollow out, but the basic operating system is still there. Around 1200 BCE in the eastern Mediterranean, you get something harsher. This is the moment when multiple Bronze Age civilizations, the Mycenaean kingdoms in Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, coastal polities in the Levant, parts of Cyprus and beyond, hit a wall at roughly the same time. We've already met the Megadroughts, the Sea Peoples, the system crash in the Amarna letters. Now we're going to zoom in on what comes after the firestorm, because what happens next is one of the clearest examples we have of a civilizational reset, where the new version of the system boots up with fewer features. And a lot of those missing features are exactly the ones we associate with high civilization: literacy, bureaucracy, complex art, precision engineering. To see it, you don't look for fallen walls or burned palaces. You look at what stops showing up. Before 1200 BCE, in places like Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae, you're swimming in writing. Clay tablets with diplomatic correspondence, palace archives full of grain accounts, chariot inventories, lists of workers and rations, monumental inscriptions boasting of campaigns and building projects, scribal schools training the next generation to handle cuneiform hieroglyphs, Linear B alphabetic scripts. Then, in many regions, the record just thins. In Greece, the Linear B tablets that recorded palace economics vanish with the palaces themselves. For centuries afterward, we have almost no local writing at all. We still find pottery, houses, graves, but the scribal chatter falls silent. In Anatolia, the grand Hittite capital with its libraries of cuneiform tablets is abandoned. Later sites in the region have material culture, people living and farming, local elites of some kind, but the dense written bureaucracy that once mapped every field, vassal and treaty is gone. In the Levant, you can trace something similar. Late Bronze Age coastal cities show archives full of tablets in multiple languages. Early Iron Age layers, by contrast, often have far fewer texts, and when writing reappears more visibly centuries later, it's in different scripts, for different purposes, under different regimes. Archaeologists call the centuries after 1200 BCE, in many of these regions, a Dark Age. Not because everyone suddenly forgot how to farm or build shelter, but because our main light source, written records, dims dramatically. But that's only half of the story, because along with the words, something else changes: the stuff. Late Bronze Age palaces were like 3D catalogues of specialized craft. Intricately inlaid furniture, fine painted pottery with complex motifs, mass-produced standardized ceramic forms that imply centralized control and quality checks, gold and silver work, glass faience, elaborate ivory carvings, precision-built chariots. All of that required a deep pyramid of skills. Miners, smelters, carpenters, weavers, metalworkers, stonecutters, scribes, managing supply chains. After the collapse in many sites, that artisanal pyramid gets chopped off near the top. Pottery becomes simpler, more local, less standardized. You still get beauty, humans don't stop caring about aesthetics, but the forms are often rougher, the paint schemes less elaborate, the precision less relentless. You can feel that the giant palace workshop with 50 specialists and a chief supervisor is gone. In its place you have village potters serving local needs. Metalwork continues, but again often in cruder, more conservative forms. The stunning ritual objects and luxury weaponry of the court give way, in many places, to practical, sturdy tools and more basic personal ornaments. Fine imported materials show up less often. Long-distance trade routes that once supplied tin, copper, exotic stones, and luxury woods are disrupted or rerouted. The crafts that depended on those inputs either adapt downward or disappear. Architecture follows a similar pattern. The late Bronze Age loved monumental stone, ashlar blocks, formal palaces with multiple stories, specialized storerooms, drainage systems. These were capital-intensive, labor-intensive projects that only centralized states could pull off. After 1200 BCE, you still find people building, but the average house shrinks. Construction relies more on mud brick, fieldstone, timber, materials you and your neighbours can handle without royal engineers and massive labour drafts. Fortified hilltop sites appear, but even many of those are rough compared to the old palace complexes. If you zoom out, the impression is striking. The world doesn't go empty. It goes simpler. Elites don't vanish everywhere, but they look poorer in the archaeological record. Fewer imported luxuries, fewer monumental tombs, fewer ostentatious declarations in stone. The social gap between top and bottom narrows, not because everyone suddenly became equal, but because the top lost some of its toys. But remember, a dark age in our evidence doesn't automatically mean a dark age in people's lived experience. We're seeing the disappearance of particular kinds of complexity. Writing tied to big bureaucracies, high-end crafts tied to long-distance trade, grand architecture tied to centralized states. We're not seeing inside every oral tradition, every small workshop, every improvised village council that kept daily life going. And here's where it gets interesting for us. Because if you just look at the headlines, writing disappears, craft standards fall, monuments stop, you might assume this is pure catastrophe, the end of civilization in those regions. But when you look more closely at the layers that follow, you start seeing something else emerging in the ruins. New settlement patterns, new ethnic labels, new political forms that don't fit the old palace model at all. We'll get into that in the next part, when we look at who kept going after the scribes put down their styluses, and what kind of world they were quietly building in the shadows of the fallen courts. So imagine you're living in that after the last shipments from the palace have stopped coming. The big storage rooms are empty or looted or burned. The officials who used to hand out rations and bark orders are gone, dead or hiding in some back valley. But you still wake up hungry. What actually happens on the ground is not that everyone dies in the ruins of palaces. It's that people start moving, shrinking, and rerouting their lives around smaller, more resilient hubs. In a lot of regions, you can literally see the map change. Those late Bronze Age coastal cities that were plugged into international trade. Many of them contract or are abandoned. At the same time, new inland villages and hilltop sites pop up. Populations pull back from exposed, trade-dependent centres and move toward places that can defend themselves and feed themselves. In Greece, the big Mycenaean palace centres fade, and you begin to see smaller, scattered settlements on defensible heights. The houses are modest, the pottery local, the storage more household-based than centralised. It's as if the spreadsheet that once tracked every bushel of grain has been erased, and each family now keeps its own mental ledger. In the highlands of the Levant, there's a wave of new small settlements right after the collapse period. Simple four-room houses, terraced agriculture, local pottery. These are not the great walled cities of the late Bronze Age. They look like clusters of extended families carving out a living on marginal land that the old elites never bothered with. To an empire, those kinds of places are background noise. To people trying to survive a systemic crash, they're lifeboats. You can also see resilience in the way people handle risk. Before the palace absorbed a huge amount of uncertainty, bad harvest, the granaries smooth it out, need timber, tin, or grain from far away. Diplomatic networks and merchant fleets make it happen. Specialized craft workers can afford to focus on one skill because the larger system backs them up. When that backing collapses, specialization becomes dangerous. Being the one guy in town who makes inlaid ivory furniture is not a great business model when nobody can pay for ivory. So skills rebundle, households and villages diversify what they do. The same family might farm, craft basic pottery, weave, and do seasonal herding. Instead of long, brittle supply chains, you get short, flexible ones. Less efficient in boom times, much safer in busts. Migration is another survival strategy that leaves a faint but telling trace. Some communities literally pick up and go. You can see pottery styles, burial customs and house plans jump from one region to another over a few generations. Not as a single invading horde, but as a slow, persistent seep of people looking for safer ground. Higher hills, better water, less competition, fewer raiders. Sometimes this movement hardens into new identities. Think about the Philistines in the southern Levant. The name shows up later in written sources, but archaeologically you can see something weird earlier. A distinctive package of pottery styles, dietary habits, and architectural features that looks partly Aegean, partly local. Not a simple copy of Mycenaean Greece, not a continuation of Canaanite cities, but a hybrid culture that emerged where displaced groups mixed with locals and built something new. In the Northern Highlands, the same centuries that look dark in palace terms are when early Israelite and Aramaean identities start to coalesce. Again, not because someone issued a memo declaring a new nation, but because scattered hill farmers, refugees and small clan groups began to share stories, cult sites and practices in a landscape no longer dominated by big Bronze Age courts. If you zoom in on a single village in this period, what you'd probably see is not apocalypse, but hard pragmatism. More grain stored at the household level, because nobody trusts a central authority to be there next year. More simple fortifications, ditches, walls, watchtowers, put up by locals who don't expect a royal garrison to save them. More marriages and alliances struck between neighbouring hamlets, because your survival now depends on who will actually show up when the raiders come over the ridge. That's another underappreciated form of resilience. Social rewiring. Under the old palace system, your primary vertical loyalty might be to the king, the temple, the bureaucracy that fed you. In the post-collapse world, horizontal ties matter more. Kinship networks, local patronage, informal councils of elders. These are low-tech, low-visibility institutions. They don't carve their decisions in stone or leave behind archives. But they can be incredibly robust, and out of those networks, over generations, come new stories of who we are. Old imperial brands like Hittite or Mycenaean fade or fragment. In their place you start to hear about Phoenicians, Philistines, Israelites, Aramaeans, and later Greeks who no longer see themselves as subjects of Palace X, but as members of a city, a tribe, a people defined by language, cult, and shared memory. From our vantage point, looking backward, it's tempting to treat those new labels as inevitable destinies. But they were, in many ways, crash adaptations, ways of organising loyalty, cooperation, and meaning in a world where the old integration mechanisms had failed. And this is where the Dark Age label really misleads us. Because once you start seeing the villages, the migrations, the new identities, you realise the system didn't just lose complexity. It was also quietly incubating new forms of it, forms that didn't yet write much, didn't build giant palaces, but were already laying foundations for the next round of expansion. The twist is how long that incubation can last, and how different the rebooted system looks from the one that crashed. To see that, you have to follow these hilltop farmers and hybrid coastal communities forward a few more centuries, into the moment when literacy and high craft come roaring back, but attached to a very different set of institutions. And when they come back, that's your clue that what you're looking at is not just a collapse story, but a transformation story. Because the scripts and luxury crafts that vanish for a while don't reappear as museum pieces from a lost age. They come back as tools in a new operating system. Take Greece. During the Palatial Bronze Age, the Mycenaean elites used a syllabic script we call Linear B. It was perfect for palace work, tracking rations, herds, labour, offerings. Then the palaces burn, the archives disappear, and for a few hundred years you get almost no writing at all. If you stop the story there, it would look like a civilizational dead end. But then, centuries later, someone on those same coasts borrows an alphabetic idea from the Levant, tweaks it, and invents the Greek alphabet. It's simpler than Linear B, more flexible and, crucially, not chained to a palace bureaucracy. Over time, it becomes a medium for epic poetry, public decrees, philosophy, drama. An elite accounting script dies, a citizen and storyteller script is born. That's what a transformation looks like from the inside. The same basic need, recording speech, migrates into a different social structure and takes on a different shape. You see the same pattern with craft. Late Bronze Age elites loved big, showy, labour-intensive things, gold-inlaid chariots, ivory furniture, ultra-fine imported ceramics. Those objects needed long-distance trade, specialist workshops and patrons with land and slaves to burn. When the system that pays for all that collapses, those crafts don't exactly go extinct. Instead, the skill base fractures and diffuses. Metalwork doesn't vanish. It shifts. You move from ornate ceremonial weapons to more standardized utilitarian tools and arms. Pottery loses some of its polychrome flourish, but becomes more modular, more regionally distinct, better suited to smaller markets. Textiles go from palace-controlled output to household expertise, with some households quietly becoming the new local specialists. On a spreadsheet that looks like decline, fewer types of fancy things, less evidence of long-distance luxury trade. On the ground, it can look more like retooling. Producers are no longer serving a handful of royal courts. They're tuning their skills to the needs of small towns, local cult centres, militias, merchant families. The art doesn't disappear. The client list changes. And as those clients change, so does power. In the late Bronze Age, authority often flowed from control of nodes, palaces, ports, archives, royal storehouses. Control the choke points, you control the system. After the crash, when things reassemble, authority is tied less to static storage and more to moving networks, caravans, ships, credit relationships, mercenary bands, city councils. The technology and craft that re-emerge are optimized for that world. Phoenician city-states are a perfect example. They're heirs to Canaanite cultures that lived through the collapse. Out of that dark period, you get tight, maritime-oriented cities like Tyre and Sidon. Their elites don't sit in massive inland palaces. They ride the new reality: shipbuilding, seafaring, trade outposts, alphabetic writing turned into contracts and correspondence. From the perspective of the old Bronze Age system, that's a calm down. Where are the great monumental archives, the chariot armies, the huge inland estates? From the perspective of the next 500 years of Mediterranean history, it's an upgrade. These are the people who spread alphabetic literacy, who knit a new trading web that will eventually plug into Greeks, Assyrians, and beyond. In other words, the Dark Age is the pivot that makes the Iron Age possible. The same logic plays out in politics. When big territorial states break, it's easy to read the gap before new empires as simple fragmentation. More little polities, less integration, therefore regression, but fragmentation can be a design space. Lots of small competing communities get to run different experiments in governance, military organization, and economic strategy without a single empire imposing uniformity. Some emphasize hoplite citizen armies, others double down on cavalry. Some build trade leagues, others lean into temple economies or charismatic warlords. Most of those experiments fail or remain local. A few become templates. The city-state model in Greece, the small kingdom in the Levant, the tribal confederation in the highlands, These aren't just what's left over when empires die. They're new institutional packages forged in the vacuum, stress-tested in a rough environment. Later empires will co-opt and scale those packages. Assyria and Babylonia borrow West Semitic mercantile tools and religious forms. Persia learns how to stitch together a mosaic of small polities under a looser imperial umbrella. Classical Greece turns the scrappy, orally transmitted epics of the Dark Age into written cultural capital that unifies people who will never meet, but can all recite the same stories. Collapse, in that sense, is not an on-off switch for civilization. It's a reshuffle of who gets to define what civilization looks like. The palace scribes and court artisans of 1200 BCE lose their monopoly on memory and prestige. In their place, over generations, you get rhapsodes, prophets, lawgivers, citizen assemblies, merchant syndicates, philosophical schools. The toolkit, writing, metallurgy, architecture, accounting, survives. What changes is who wields it, and for what. That's the deeper warning, and the deeper reassurance, buried in the so-called Dark Age. Civilizations almost never vanish cleanly. They mutate. Their knowledge leaks and pools in unexpected places. Their failures open ecological and institutional niches that someone else will fill, usually with a different value system and a different idea of what progress means. If you're standing inside one of these systems today, watching your own version of palaces, archives and highcraft wobble, the Late Bronze Age has a message. Yes, complex structures can crash. Yes, literacy can retreat into narrower channels. Yes, visible splendor can dim. But that isn't the end of the story. It's the point where the definition of advanced quietly starts to move from bigger, richer, more centralized toward more distributed, more adaptable, more tightly meshed with the landscape and the real risk profile. That transition can be harsh, unfair, and violent. A lot is lost, including things worth mourning, but it also opens space for new languages, new institutions, and new identities that would have been impossible under the old order. Which brings us back to the Sumerian reset cycle. If the pattern holds, the question isn't whether our current civilization will change. It's whether we understand that when the old metrics of complexity start to fall, the seeds of the next system are already germinating in places we're not looking. Hilltop villages instead of palaces, local co-ops instead of international conglomerates. New forms of literacy and craft that don't yet look elite, but might be exactly what the next version of civilized needs. And whether we like it or not, history suggests that by the time the archives go quiet, the reboot is already underway. So where does that leave us in the Sumerian reset cycle we're living through? We've just walked from the Akkadian Megadrought to poisoned irrigation, from late Bronze Age system crashes and sea peoples to Assyrian overshoot, plague shock, and the long shadow of Dark Ages that were really reboots. The same feedback loops keep showing up. Ecological strain, elite overreach, network fragility, informational bottlenecks, and then, slowly, new operating systems forming in the rubble. The real question is, which side of that curve are you on right now? I'd love to hear where you're listening from, and what signs you see around you that feel like early-stage collapse or early-stage transformation. Drop a comment, especially if you're in a place already feeling climate stress, political fragmentation, or institutional fatigue. If this dive into ancient reset cycles helped you think differently about the present, hit like so more people actually see it, and subscribe if you want more long-form deep history tied to what's happening now. And if you want to support this kind of research-heavy content in the best way possible, listen on Spotify. The link's in the description. That's the platform that helps keep this series sustainable while we ride out whatever version of the next reset we're already inside.